Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 23rd meeting in 2012 of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. As usual, can I ask everyone to ensure they have switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please. The first item of business today is to consider whether to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Agenda item 2 is PRS and Local Government Strand 2 benchmarking and performance measures. Today we'll be taking oral evidence from 3 panels from COSLA, local authorities and the Improvement Service. The first of our panels represent COSLA. Could I welcome David O'Neill, President of COSLA, Michael Cook, Vice President of COSLA, Barbara Lindsay, Depute Chief Executive, and Adam Stewart, Policy Manager for COSLA. Councillor O'Neill, would you like to make an opening statement to the committee, please?
Thanks very much, Chair. Can I start with saying I haven't switched my mobile phone off, but the good news is it's sitting on my desk in Verity House. So if it does go off and we hear it from here, it's awful loud. Can I start by saying that local government is absolutely committed to improving outcomes for our communities. And almost everything that we do is based round about that, about getting better outcomes. To achieve that, one of the things that we are aware of that we need to do is we need to understand how we are performing. So over the years, we've worked hard to develop robust performance management frameworks, and we've used independent audit to support us within that. We're very conscious of the fact no matter how good we sometimes think we are at things, there will always be scope for improvement. There's always room for improvement. But I do want to emphasise that we see this as being, while we're signed up for it, while we're committed to it, we see it very much as an improvement tool. What we're very clear about that it should not be used for, it should not be used as a big stick with which to beat us. We need to see a culture developed here in Scotland which allows people to say, you know, there are things that we are good at and there are things that we are poor at. And by recognising where we are poor, where our performance is poor, we can then seek to not only to identify that, but to address it and to improve performance. So that's the main thrust of what COSLA is going to be saying today, that we're signed up, we're committed to benchmarking as an improvement tool, and we hope to work with the whole of the public sector to improve outcomes for all of the communities that we represent.
Thank you very much for that. Can I begin by asking, this has been a long process in terms of agreeing all of this, some 2 years in the making. Can I ask why you think that this has taken so long before there has been agreement on the way forward in terms of benchmarking?
I think it would be fair to say that the public sector as a whole was not particularly good at a number of things. Procurement, the public sector wasn't good at procurement. Unit costs, the public sector was not good at unit costs. But we are now much better at these things, and we now recognise the value in them. We now know largely what unit costs are, what we're actually using our money for. But we were starting from a very low base, I've got to say, and we have to recognise that the private sector were much better at some of these things than we were. And I think it did take the public sector, and I emphasise the public sector, not just local government, it did take the public sector a long time to recognise that there was a weakness there. But having recognised that that weakness existed, I think we have gone at it at some pace, and I would suggest that 2 years in local government ain't an awful long time.
Having had the experience of being an elected member in local government for quite some time, I realise that sometimes things do take a long time, which is one of my main frustrations about local government. Michael?
Yes, Chair. If I can add a couple of points in relation to that, I think the history here is important. I think it's very important, particularly to recognise that councils haven't woken up one day and suddenly thought we need to carry out comparative analysis. Actually, that's something that's gone on all the time that you would remember, and certainly throughout all of the time I've been a member. So it's gone on all of the time. What this reflects, I think, is a difference in approach. We've been particularly good, I think, at trying to respond to best value since the Local Government Act in 2003. I think certainly my council has been engaged in that on 2 occasions. We've also been a pilot project in relation to this latest iteration in terms of trying to deal with performance information and to use it effectively in our management of councils. So there has been that line of progress, and I think it's important that we recognise that. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this change, however, is that we're moving to a position in which any one of the indicators must be able to be collected on a comparative basis across all of the 32 councils. So the comparative analysis aspect of this is in relation to that, and that seems to me to be the key building block in relation to this approach for the future. So I think it would be a misunderstanding to suggest that while certainly there were some deficiencies in the past, that there wasn't an effort to gather that information and to make analysis. We did it all of the time, but I think this is a step on that road. There's a constant iterative process there, and that's something that we'll continue to build on, not least in relation to the other strand of evidence that you've been taking recently in relation to community planning. Clearly, there will be a desire to build on the process that we're now engaged in to move forward so that actually we can carry out benchmarking in relation to community planning partnerships and not merely local authorities.
I think that we recognise that there is now to be some uniformity in terms of benchmarking. One of the difficulties that there has been, and this has come out during the course of our evidence sessions in this, is the fact that in many cases before, where benchmarking exercises were undertaken by local authorities, we were told that it was often comparing apples with pears, and then there was the abandonment of projects because the benchmarking did not stack as folks saw it, because there was that measure of apples and pears. So, I mean, the uniformity thing, I think we would welcome. But I think we've got to recognise, and maybe you'd like to comment further, and while we do know that there was benchmarking before, there were difficulties because there was not that uniformity. I don't know, do you want to pick up on that, Michael or David?
I can say a few words about that. You'll be aware of the report that went to leaders produced by Solace.
Sure.
And I think that's actually indication of a strength within what we're trying to do, that it's the people who actually deliver these services on the ground, the people who take the lead, the chief executives and the senior officers within local government who have developed this process. So they've developed it in such a way that it will maximise the benefits to local government. I think had it been something that had been imposed from the outside, it might have been something that we had a bit more difficulty with. But this benchmarking is a creature of local government. It's a tool that's been developed by local government officers, and I think that is a strength. There will still need to be an element of groupings, if you like, families of local authorities. Yesterday, Barbara and I were in Shetlands, meeting the Shetland Island Council. Monday of next week we're going to meet the City of Glasgow Council. You probably can't get two more different councils than that. So we need to take account of the fact that there is a degree of apples and pears within it, but we take account of it and it doesn't get used as an excuse not to do.
Thank you. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Thank you. You've touched on this a little bit, Councillor O'Neill, just saying that this is a tool of local government, but key to it, I would imagine, is ensuring that you take staff and elected members on board, so this becomes, an automatic feature of service management. How do you ensure that happens?
Well, we see performance as being one of the 4 pillars of public sector reform. Need to see if I can get what the 4 pillars are. Performance being 1, people being 2, prevention being 3, and integration being 4. So we need to have this embedded within the culture of the organisations, within the culture of each individual local authority. When people are sitting down doing their daily work, that needs to be the default position. The officers that are responsible for performance, officers that are responsible for procuring services, are making sure, just as a matter of course, because that's what they do day in, day out, that we're getting best value for money and we're getting the best outcomes for the communities that we represent. And it's less about ticking boxes and more about getting positive outcomes.
Can I perhaps add to that a little?
Michael.
I think I'll answer that very simply by saying that actually the people who have the strongest interest in how councils perform are elected members and senior managers in councils, those employed within councils. We have, as soon as you come into local government, you're engaged on a journey which actually is about trying to ensure that you have a process of continuous improvement in delivering the best that you can for the taxpayer out there, for the constituent, for the visitor to your area. And actually, as I was saying earlier, I think we've long been engaged in a process of continuous improvement. The best value approach is evidence of that. So members are absolutely committed to being involved in this process. On a personal level, I've certainly been involved in it since 2003 directly in all of the performance improvement processes within our council and take a very keen interest in that. Chair things like the performance improvement panel to check that we're doing or striving to do what we want to aspire to, and that's something that goes on all the time. So actually, while MSPs may think that they provide a level of challenge in relation to the aspirations of council, the people who challenge councils most are those who have that direct political responsibility within council, and that's elected members.
Any other comments from the other 2 panellists?
Adam?
Possibly just worth considering at this point that councils are subject to a whole range of performance indicators and audit frameworks and external challenge. One of the opportunities around about this project is to take ownership of those indicators which we think add the greatest value to our understanding of management information locally, and also as part of the next stage of that journey, taking another look at whether there are other elements of external frameworks or other indicators which perhaps add less value but are nonetheless resource intensive or can perhaps distract management attention from the core information which really indicates the outcomes that are being delivered for communities. So as part of this process, we want to look further than where we are at the moment to the wider range of indicators and performance information that is being collected and take that honest look at whether all of that adds value and whether that can be improved in a similar way.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah.
I think just to say that as we indicated in our written evidence, this has been a theme of almost every visit that the presidential team and ourselves have made to councils. This need to improve outcomes, get best value for money, and absolutely bear down on performance to do that. So I think you're right to say we need to take staff and elected members with us on that journey, but I think that is not an uphill struggle. I think they are very much at the forefront of that, and that's come across very clearly at our meetings with councils.
Thank you for that. Well, I think the next question that follows on from that then, do you consider that you've got enough relevant resources to do this interpretation and to make effective use of the benchmarking data? And if not, can the Scottish Government or other national bodies do more?
David?
Are you offering us more money?
Absolutely not.
Probably because of a reduced resource. It's more important that we do this to make sure that we are getting best value. The current mayor of Boston used to be Barack Obama's chief of staff, Rams Emanuel, and he said you should never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, here we are right in the middle of the biggest crisis, financial crisis that we've seen since the Second World War. And that should be a driver to all of us to do things better than we currently do. And I think the other thing to say about this, there is no end point to this. You don't get to a point where suddenly you say, that's it, we're doing performance as good as we should, we're doing benchmarking as good as we could. It's a continuous process and we should never get to the end of it.
I suppose before we move on, though, when we're talking about resources, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of actual financial cash. It could be, for example, the secondment of someone from another body to help you with the comparability. And, for example, I think we heard from Scottish Water some excellent examples of how they turned that organisation round, and therefore there may be some value in listening or having someone, seconded from there to teach or to give some examples of how they managed to do what they achieved.
Certainly, if somebody has got better experience than us, we are happy to learn from anyone. And if anybody's got a good idea, we'll be happy to steal it. I could maybe ask Barbara to say a wee bit more.
Barbara?
I suppose just to emphasise that, as the Vice President said, we've got to make this part of everybody's job rather than looking at it as something where you bring somebody in from the outside. We've got the commitment of chief executives, leaders and senior staff, and we have the support of the improvement service as well. So I think we embark upon this journey of learning and improvement, and yes, we should be open to looking to other sources of good practice if that's appropriate.
Okay. Michael?
What we also need to do is we need to reflect on where we're moving from to. So actually we're moving from a position which Adam correctly described in terms of there being a whole series of auditing bodies and assessment bodies, scrutiny bodies, looking at the performance of councils. Now, since the Crerar review, there has been an effort to declutter that landscape, and actually that very much fits with local authorities' aspiration, which is for effective, efficient and proportionate scrutiny. So if we develop a model here which is fit for purpose, allows proper comparisons to be made Scotland-wide in terms of proper information for management purposes to allow us to drive best value and continuous improvement, we'll have got to the right place. But actually, part of it is getting to that degree of proportionate scrutiny, and we think that this is probably a tool which will help us get there.
So the very last question I'd like to ask is, you mentioned you have already some performance indicators, Audit Scotland, I think, or independent audit being one of them. Do you see benchmarking and the information you get from this fitting into these other performance indicators?
David?
Some of the technicalities would actually be better getting addressed to Solace than ourselves, but yes, it's part of a suite of tools. It's not just one thing. We must obviously take account of what external regulators and auditors are saying. I mean, Audit Scotland are obviously aware of the benchmark, and I've had informal discussions with John Bailey from the Accounts Commission. He was aware that we were coming here today to discuss that. So again, it's about getting an ethos across the whole of the public sector, benchmarking, continuous improvement, best value. It should all be embedded in there as part of the culture.
Michael?
Simply to add, we have a series of statutory performance indicators at the present time, some of which, frankly, are pretty redundant. So, for example, you might look up a statutory performance indicator which tells you how many people go to the local swimming pool. Actually, the genuine value of that is questionable. You need to look at that in terms of certainly the inputs in the top, but the performance of the local authority in relation to the service it's providing as well. So I think there is an expectation, and I would think that Audit Scotland is at least thinking in this direction, that as we develop these new mechanisms for making comparative analysis, so things like the existing SPIs are likely to fall away and become genuinely redundant.
And I suppose preventative spend would come into that, rather than looking at the raw data, just what is the effect and, you know, a healthy outcome.
Yeah, it's absolutely not simply about the raw data here. And the information that we gather in from this exercise, it comes principally from local financial information. You need to look at that in detail and consider all of the different angles in that if you're going to use it effectively as a management tool within your local authority.
Okay. John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I was interested in the comments that were made in terms of the chief executives and senior staff delivering on the ground. It's really, my question would be around what discussions have taken place with frontline staff, and I mean genuine frontline staff who are delivering services in the communities and on the ground, and their unions. Because if you're going to introduce this benchmarking, then the benchmarking is the delivery of the service on the ground, not desk, people behind a desk, saying that that's what they're delivering. It's how do we match up, how we benchmark what's being delivered against what's genuinely being delivered on the ground by the staff in the front line.
David?
Probably that's a question that would be better answered by the individual councils, but I know from my own experience, I'm a North Ayrshire councillor, and North Ayrshire spends a considerable amount of time engaging with the workforce to make sure that we are fully aware of the issues as they see them and as they deliver them. Very conscious of the fact that as a councillor, as a chief executive, as senior officers of local authorities, they're not necessarily the people who deliver the service to the communities. As people at the front line, the cold face, call it what you may. But it's maybe worthwhile just repeating the first words that I said, that councils are absolutely committed to improving outcomes for their communities. And that is what this is all about, improving outcomes.
Michael?
I'm really just keen to endorse a couple of points that David has made there. The first is we need to remember this is a management tool principally. But what we also need to understand is that it's embedded within the DNA of culture of councils. Now, I would say in response to your question, Mr. Wilson, actually that is true and it's demonstrably true. Just as an example of that, I brought Scottish Borders Council's best value audit, the last one that we had from 2010. One of the questions that's asked in relation to councils is how pervasive is the performance culture right down through the edifice. And actually, happily in our council, it was pretty good was the answer. But that's the kind of question that has been asked since 2003 and will continue to be asked as we move forward, and that managers will be determined to secure from staff.
Thank the members for that response. In relation to and I think we're fortunate in this committee is we've got 4 ex-councillors sitting in this committee, which is the majority of members. So we do know what public service delivery is about as councillors, and as MSPs we're keen to see the best public performance delivery. And sorry, Margaret, forgot Margaret was a councillor as well. I knew her husband was a councillor, but forgot Margaret was so that's 5 of us. So that makes a formidable team in terms of council services. The point I'm trying to get to is that while it is a tool, we need to be aware that when we are measuring anything, we've got to measure that against the delivery on the ground. Because that's been part of the problem I think we've had over the years, is that there have been good management structures put in place and there's been a good accountability structures. But the reality is the delivery on the ground has not come through. And particularly Councillor Cook's comment about how many people visit a swimming pool. That may not be, you think may not be relevant, but the relevance of that is when the council comes to close down a swimming pool and they look at the numbers attending that swimming pool, how the council then makes a decision and weighs up a decision to actually benchmark, and how you benchmark that, the use of that facility may mean that services are actually cut, because the measure that you use is actually one that actually cuts back services rather than looking at the real value that service delivers.
Gentlemen. Michael?
Well, to be honest, I think that last point is missing the point. What perhaps importantly flows from that is that we need to look at contextual information in relation to swimming pools or any other factor that we're looking at. So what's important here is if you are comparing information from Highland in relation to cost per primary school pupil, and you're comparing it in relation to another local authority, that you're doing it on the basis, to use your analogy, Chair, apples and apples and pears and pears. That's why there is a move in the direction of families, so the aggregate councils, which have similar demographics, have a similar kind of population base, have similar content in terms of the people that they service, so that you can make proper judgments about these things. But what you also need to recognise, that when it comes to a whole range of these factors, is actually there is legitimate variability. There is legitimate variation, and that is based on local democracy. So it is actually up to councillors, who are the locally democrated agents within councils, to make a policy judgment about some of these things. So taking the example again of cost per pupil, that may not simply be a factor of the contextual situation in which those schools exist. That may also partly be a consequence of policy determinations that those elected members have made. And that is absolutely right. Sometimes we hear complaints about the postcode lottery. Actually, sometimes the postcode lottery is local democracy in action.
John?
Convener, that then, for me, that raises a question, and I've listened to Councillor Cook with interest, is that benchmarking will not be a uniform tool through 32 local authorities. There will be variances to that. In relation to the apples and pears comment from the convener earlier, then clearly, if we are looking for a uniform delivery in benchmarking, or, as other members have mentioned this morning, in terms of best value, how can we be certain that the measures, the benchmarking measures that are being used, are applicable to the local authorities, and local authorities do not opt out of the benchmarking measures that can be uniformly attributed to the delivery of services? Or what we're saying here today is we will have benchmarking, but benchmarking will not be able to compare the delivery of the services by 32 local authorities against these other 30, or each authority against each other. It will be actually based on families and possibly in different service delivery.
I'm slightly confused by the question. The simple fact is that we will have consistent benchmarking indicators across Scotland, but actually you will need to aggregate people or aggregate councils, recognising that the data and the information from different councils with different characteristics, different population bases, will be different. It's no more complicated than that.
Okay, Stewart Stevenson, please.
Could I just add a wee bit to that? You know, I mean, we're talking about uniform benchmarking, but we're not talking about uniform delivery of services. Local government does not deliver uniformly across its communities. My own council, the least deprived community in North Ayrshire has a life expectancy 18 years longer than our most deprived community. You don't deliver the same services to both those communities. You deliver them according to the needs of that local community. We've used the word outcome quite a few times today, and I'm happy to repeat that. And it is outcome. It's not outputs. It's not about ticking boxes. It's about getting positive outcomes for our communities.
Stewart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Convener. I've at last discovered why the two people with no council experience are so furthest away from the salt in this particular dining table.
I wouldn't take that as being the case, Mr. Stevenson.
Can I very much welcome David O'Neill's very initial comment where he said he was committed to improving outcomes, and I absolutely accept that's the case. He also said he'd copy a good idea from anywhere, so I'm going to give him one, and that is that perhaps if we want to get the staff involved, we don't talk about benchmarking at all, because it's a techie thing. We should talk about a self-improvement programme, and then everybody realises they've got to do it for themselves. However, that's for you to take away, discard or use as you wish. It's entirely to you. And certainly when Michael Cook said it's a management tool principally, I can see frontline staff immediately distancing themselves and saying it's nothing to do with me. However, that's enough of the observations, which you can deal with in any way that suits you. I just want to try and tease out how you're going to use and where the approximately 40 headings have come from. I've done my own categorisation. About a third of them seem to be measuring inputs. Most of the remainder are outputs, and one or two I'm uncertain about. But it's a subjective view. It's not an objective assessment. I don't want to suggest that. And I accept that many of the outcomes are delivered over long periods of time. So therefore you need inputs that you're keeping an eye on to determine whether you've got the right inputs in place that you believe are going to lead in the longer term to the right outcomes. My question initially is, how have you professionally, what professional skills have been deployed to identify the inputs that are on your list that you're measuring and looking at, and determining that they do have a relationship with the outcomes that you seek? And let me immediately say, picking up again what David O'Neill said, that it may be that some of the answer is not from you, but actually from Solace. I don't necessarily expect, all that answer to come from the people on the panel here, but I'd certainly like to your contribution to the answer.
Who's running with that? David?
Can say a few words around that. Thank you for your good ideas. We'll take that away and ruminate upon it. In terms of how were the benchmarking suite put together, it was Solace that put it together. Perhaps Mark, when you get around to it, Mark might be in a better position to answer detailed questions about it. But I suspect, like any tool, we will spend a considerable amount of time sharpening and honing this tool. This is the start of a process, and I suppose in a few years' time we will see some of these indicators being changed, some of them being altered. I don't think that we should see this as being set in tablets of stone, and as we improve the tool, we ought to be able to improve the outcomes for our communities.
Adam?
Really just to emphasise those points, and I think also pick up the point from Mr Stevenson and Mr Wilson round about the self-improvement agenda. This is very much one tool as part of the wider approach to performance management. Part of that approach is a much greater focus on outcomes, and we're talking a little bit about some of the challenges round about developing that. It's also very much about the heavy investment that councils have made over the last few years in terms of self-assessment through the Public Sector Improvement Framework or other EFQM-based methodologies. And all councils are now really adopting those as part of the basis for their internal scrutiny mechanisms, and are subject to some external challenge around about that as well. So although the indicators play into that environment, there is very much, I think, the developing scope for much greater ownership locally within individual services. And we've seen most councils have a very sort of comprehensive programme of self-assessment taking place over the last couple of years. There is obviously always scope to make sure that the messages from those kind of self-assessment exercises feed into the kinds of information that we're collecting as part of this exercise. And I think, given the fact that this is wholly owned by local government, there is a much more straightforward avenue for doing that than perhaps previously, when some of the indicators we might have been collecting were conjured up by external bodies or by the Accounts Commission, etc. So there is progress being made in that respect, and I think probably scope for that to be faster paced in the future.
Can I say the specific point about why you've chosen particular inputs, which I assert, without evidence, are to support your assessment of the journey to the outcomes, which may be relatively long term, hasn't been answered by what you said. But I expected a limited answer. But I think we need to make sure that as a committee we, by whatever appropriate means, get that answer. So I think that may be something to which we return. But let me just move on to another point, because I don't want to take valuable time wearing out something we're probably not going to progress too much. Michael Cook talked about comparative analysis and indicators collected on a comparative basis. And the phrase, I think, uniformity occurred at some point. And I just wondered, the ability to compare information from disparate environments is normally gone through a process which is known as normalisation, so that it becomes valid to make comparisons. And I just wonder what advice and what process and who's advising the councillors who may not have done much of this before, because it's a slightly different approach, as to how professionally we're going to ensure that the normalisation is done in a way that is actually useful to each council. Because even the very best performing council, that might be so far ahead of everyone else that's in your face and you know it, should still be able to look at the activities of other councils and say they are still doing something better than we are and continue the process of improvement. But that can only happen if there's a normalisation. And I just wonder how you think that will be done, because in a sense it has to be a very objective process, probably external to individual councils, but my assertion might be wrong. You may have a different approach.
Who's picking up on that? David?
I mean, I think the reason that we are confident that it will work, the people who designed this are the practitioners. Right. They actually do this on a day-to-day basis.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? These are the practitioners already employed with the councils?
Yes. Solace I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So it's the chief executives and the senior officers and the senior managers feeding into it who drew this project together.
Well, can I just and I think that's absolutely right. Proper the leadership would have to lie there in a technical sense. But are you also telling me that the Solace thought they had all the necessary skills at the outset, or did they take steps to acquire those skills, or advisors who had those skills? Because certainly my experience, as senior management level, I never assumed I had all the necessary skills, mostly concluded I did not.
David? You would really need to ask Solace that question, whether they thought that was the case. But my experience of Solace is that they are not shy at saying we do or we do not have the necessary skills.
I think we can pick that up with the third panel of the day,
fine.
Mr. Stevenson.
We'll move on from me.
Okay, thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
Good morning, panel. Can I take us back to community planning? What do you foresee, what do you think the particular challenges of applying the benchmarking approach to the community planning partnerships, especially in terms of the contribution to the delivery of outcomes?
David?
I'm a great fan of community planning. I think if we can get the whole of the public sector signed up in at least as strong a way as local government is currently signed up for it, and we have the review of community planning.
Can I stop you there, David, because you says all of the public sector signed up, and I think in terms of the evidence that we've taken, much of the public sector is signed up, but the difficulty is that the private sector and the third sector, the voluntary sector in particular, don't feel that they are allowed to add the value that they possibly could. I wonder if you could maybe comment on that.
Well, I think that's probably quite a fair comment to make, but I think it's also true to say that while we have legislation at the moment that requires local authorities to participate in the community planning process, that does not yet apply to the rest of the public sector. So the rest of the public sector do come along to community planning partnerships, but they don't have the same legal requirement as the local authorities do. Now, it would be wrong of me to preempt the outcome of the review of community planning, but I think I've given a fairly strong hint what I would like to see the outcome of that review being. If we do then have that legislative framework which requires the whole of the public sector to take account of improvement tools, including benchmarking, that, in my opinion, can only be positive.
Michael?
Really just to embellish, I think what David's saying is community planning is still very much in development. Obviously, there is the National Oversight Group where ministers are meeting with representatives across the whole of the public sector, really to shape that agenda. At the same time, we have concurrently running this agenda in relation to performance improvement and benchmarking. Now, we're not going to wake up next Monday and find that we have a series of benchmarking propositions across the whole of the public sector. But I think what's important from the committee's perspective is that certainly on the part of local government, that's the aspiration, is to get to that place. There's a view, certainly within COSLA and across local government, that community planning is a very good answer to the aspiration that we have across the country to improve outcomes. That's what it's all about. And actually building mechanisms, benchmarking mechanisms, which allow us to drive performance where it's cross-sectoral. So it may be something which cuts across a local authority, health, third sector. If we can identify outcomes and indicators and use those as weapons to drive performance, we'll be getting to the right place. But it'll take us time to get there.
And you want to come back?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Can I follow up on that point? Because I think in terms of the evidence that we've taken around about community planning partnerships, we've found different things, good practice in some parts of the country, bad in others. What we have found, I would say, looking at other members who will correct me if they think I'm wrong, that the ones that seem to be stronger are the ones that involve communities and have influence from the private sector and from the third sector. David, you talked about compelling, really, folk to get involved. Do you think that's a wise thing to do, to actually compel people to become involved rather than persuade them to come on board, as has happened in many places?
So, some of the other public agencies are direct agencies of government, and if government tell them to do it, they will do it. If government tell them not to do it, then they won't do it. I know this isn't meant to be an evidence session about community planning, but I'm more than happy to make...
I think it's extremely important in terms of benchmarking services to make sure that in terms of what is being done, that we have some kind of level playing field. I think that community planning partnerships like Miss McTaggart have an immense part to play in this. And I think that where we will do well in terms of benchmarking and service improvement, it'll be the areas where community planning partnerships seem to be working better than others.
Well, right, a comment about that then. You made the comment that there are some areas where community planning is working well and some places where it isn't working well, and you're absolutely right about that. But one thing that we are clear about is we don't want to be just as good as what's currently the best in terms of community planning. We want to see a step change in community planning so that everybody moves up to a higher plane, a higher level than we currently have, all delivering positive outcomes for our communities. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Well, just to add that if we don't get the step change, we're going to have a big difficulty, aren't we? We all know what's actually in the process of coming onto us in terms of the financial context in which we're operating, and what's driving, I suppose, the community planning discussion in terms of the national group is that anxiety about recognising what lies out there, the need to improve outcomes in a context where resources are under pressure for a whole range of reasons, growing demand, but also a substantial reduction in resources. Unless we get a step change, the £3.9 billion which we're going to have to find by 2016-17, we're going to struggle to do that, quite frankly. So I think on the part of local government, and we also detect on the part of national government, there is a genuine desire to use community planning to come up with some of those answers, and that's the direction that we're driving in.
Okay.
Could I maybe just come back
David,
again?
yep.
I mean, one of the aspects about community planning that has proven to be successful is where, at the beginning, it was seen as a delivery, a community of delivery organisations. Now, that was where it was working quite well. But we've moved on beyond that. Community planning now is not only about a community of delivery organisations, it's now about place. It's about geographical communities and delivering for those communities.
I'm sure that we're going to have you back here at some point to talk further about community planning. John Pentland, please.
Yeah. David, in your letter to the Chair, Kevin, you had mentioned that many discussions have taken place in benchmarking, but your major concern was not about the benchmarking framework itself. It was about the external environment created by the media, audit bodies and parliamentarians. And that comment is quite similar to a recent committee's event where the biggest risk identified was media management. You know, once the benchmarking data was made public. What are COSLA's views on this, and how should publicity of the data best be handled?
Who's going to deal with that?
I'm happy to.
David?
Happy to start, Chair, and anybody else can put their tuppence worth in. There is a danger with this that we end up with league tables. Journalists will inevitably sit down and look at the results of this benchmarking, and they'll put it into league tables. If that's all that happens with this, then frankly we've wasted an awful lot of time and effort. We need to get beyond that. One of the ways that we can get beyond that is by politicians acting in a more mature manner. For example, within local authorities, if we end up with one authority ending up at the wrong end of a benchmarking report, for the opposition within that council to then use it as a club to batter the administration about the head is going to be the wrong thing to do. If we see MSPs using it as a club to batter local authorities about the head, it's going to be the wrong thing to do. And we can hardly criticise journalists for doing it if we as politicians are going to do it. So there needs to be a degree of maturity coming from the politicians. If you go to some of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden I think it is, where they've been doing this for many years, they have that degree of maturity where it is already seen as an improvement tool and it is not used as a club just to batter folk. So that's something that we're very conscious of. And when COSLA were drawing this scheme up, when Solace were drawing this scheme up, they spent a considerable amount of their time debating with themselves as to whether it should go into the public domain or not. Now, the conclusion that they came to, and I agree with, if it doesn't go in the public domain through your own hand, it will go into the public domain through somebody else's hand. So you're as well just getting it out there and trying to develop the appropriate level of maturity that's required to make it work.
Michael?
David's touched on the wee story I was going to offer up by way of an exemplar, but at the COSLA conference back in March this year, we did have a representative from Swedish local government who came along and was talking about benchmarking. And she was asked about how it played within the Swedish public domain. And actually our response is, as David has hinted, that the culture in Sweden is that where there is a deficiency, where there is a defect, actually the effort then is to rally round and make sure that that last ship in the convoy, that everybody pulls in the same direction to make sure that it's running at the same speed as others. So there is a kind of maturity to the political and public reporting culture there, which I think would be a noble aspiration for us here. And of course, if the committee can help us get to that aspiration, that would be very helpful indeed.
Adam?
Just a point about some of the practical things we can do around about some of this. One of the actions we are taking alongside Solace and Improvement Services to develop some media messages that explain the indicators, perhaps give an insight into what it does tell you, perhaps what it doesn't tell you in terms of variation, a little bit about how you can interpret that information locally, really with a view to making sure that when people take a look at the information, they do have in their mind some of the legitimate variation that might be around about that. That will accompany the making public of the information in the early new year.
John, do you want to come back?
No, I think that answers that one. Just maybe one further question, Chair. It's with regards
Can I take Stuart Stevenson and Margaret Mitchell in those points? Because I think they had things on that point. And Stuart McMillan, did you have something on that point as well?
Well, it's going to be a different question.
Okay, I'll take you on afterwards. Stuart Stevenson, then Margaret Mitchell.
I wonder if councillors have considered the presentational and information provision approach that the government uses through Scotland's Performance website, where basically for each council, I imagine it would be on each one, it's improving, it's steady state, or it's deteriorating. Because if you provide the media with, you know, some, and that would be proper to compare councils with each other on not how they're doing, but whether they're moving in the right direction. And I think that would be proper political debate around that. And it would also, of course, if you were to take that approach, you would be giving the media something that they could, without much effort, actually use, and then the debate would be perhaps focused in a different way. And I think in government we found that, well, we haven't always found it pleasant, because there are some arrows, you know, go down, that's what happens. But then you focus on them, and I guess as an approach I commend it to you and ask if you've had a wee think about that one.
An approach you've considered, Adam?
Well, that's very much in keeping with the kind of approaches that individual councils will use in terms of their public performance reporting reports, and obviously technology has a large part to play in some of that. In terms of the publication of the information, I think Mark McAteer would be better placed to give you specifics in terms of the format, but certainly in terms of the web availability and the analysis of that's very much on the card. Yeah.
Good. Margaret Mitchell.
I'm afraid what's coming over from the panel is, please don't criticise us. There will be bad information out there, but, you know, don't say, you know, this is unacceptable and it shouldn't have happened. I do accept, you know, you make these comments, but for me, the key thing is this has been identified and this council is going to do something about it. So if you really are signed up to benchmarking, then inherent in that should be a very robust response that benchmarking has actually achieved what you wanted it to achieve. It's identified what you're doing well. Equally, it's identified the weaknesses and the shortcomings. And crucially, what we can now do as a result of that is work on these weaknesses and shortcomings and make improvements. Now, I think if you have that attitude to both journalists and to politicians, then you really are sold in benchmarking and you're giving a very robust response, rather than going down the line which Mr. Stewart was suggesting of, yeah, these are the figures, but here are the mitigating factors, which is almost like we're making excuses. Be upfront, we're not happy with this performance. Benchmarking has highlighted that. We're pleased it has. It gives us the opportunity to do something about it.
Michael?
There are a number of aspects to that, but plainly we're not saying don't criticise poor performance or failures. There's an acceptance that the poor performance would be criticised, but actually we need to recognise that the arch critics are really councillors and people within councils who perhaps sometimes have a better grasp of some of the issues which are developing those, notwithstanding, of course, the huge experience outlined in relation to what exists on the committee. But we also need to recognise, again, what the purpose of these are. Management tool, that's exactly what it is. These are can openers to allow us to get into information in councils, to drill down and find out why certain things, allowing for contextual information, are different. And where we identify it's different, there will be a political pressure on managers within councils to make sure that we change that for the better and that we get to a place which is not only the best in Scotland, but is better than the existing best in Scotland. That's the kind of aspiration that we're talking about here. What we have currently, without overstating it, is typically a culture where councils are sometimes used as footballs without any context being applied, and that's simply unhelpful. For example, if you take an example like payment of bills and you set up something which isn't an SPI even at the present moment, the SPI is payment within 28 days, but if you set a false perspective in relation to that and criticise councils on that basis, then that's simply a negative story without any genuine purpose designed to drive improvement within that council.
Barbara, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I suppose it was just to say I absolutely don't think the message is don't criticise us, but we've got to create a culture across the public sector of change and improvement, and that means creating an environment where it's entirely feasible to say, yes, we've collected this information, we've produced it. Everybody is clear about what it means and what it doesn't mean, so it's not just a crude comparison, but that we've got a culture in the public sector then where it's possible to say we use that now to improve.
Margaret Mitchell.
Just very briefly to Councillor Coote, I'm very much encouraged by the beginning of his response and discouraged by then what he went on to say. If there's a problem with late payment bills, say there is. Look and see there is a problem. If there isn't, justify why you've done what you've done. But make sure you're robust, and the whole ethos is improvement. And I think we're both agreed on that point.
Michael, very briefly.
We're absolutely disposed to that. That's the point. We would do it on the basis of the proper benchmarking indicator.
John Wilson on this point.
On this point, it's really, I'm looking at the SOLAS benchmarking suite that was sent to the committee. 50% of those identified have the word cost in them. From the cost per primary school pupil through to the total cost for HR per 1,000 employees, down to the cost per visit to libraries, cost to visit to museums, cost of waste collection per premises. How do we get round the issue, particularly cost per road maintenance, when you're actually putting in measures? And if you're trying to compare that against 32 local authorities who will have varying costs for the delivery of these services, how do we measure benchmarking against 50% of the identified indicators being about the cost of delivery of services within local authorities? Because clearly, as Councillor Coote referred to earlier, some local authorities will have different cost factors involved in delivery of services than others. Some, because Councillor O'Neill mentioned the delivery of services in deprived areas, will be different from others. But when you actually indicate the 50, out of the indicators that we have here, 50% of them are down to cost. And how do we measure? And that's where I think the media particularly will be very interested to see how much it costs Glasgow City Council to deliver per visit to a museum compared to, say, North Ayrshire's visits, cost per visit to the museums in North Ayrshire. And that's where we could end up creating a bigger rod for the backs of local authorities in terms of what they like to deliver and see as added value to a community, rather than just particularly putting the pounds and pence cost on the services being delivered.
Gentlemen.
I am not at all clear
David.
why you wouldn't want to know what it costs you to deliver a service. I mean, that just seems to me to be...
Convener, I'm trying to make the point. What you're saying is that if we're benchmarking 32 local authorities and you're using that as the suite of measures that you actually measure the performance of local authority against local authority, then clearly some local authorities are going to be spending more per visit to a museum than other local authorities. And people, some people, not saying all people, will be then raising the question, why is North Ayrshire paying X amount for a visit to a museum where Glasgow only pays Y amount?
Gentlemen, Barbara.
Could I just say 3 quick things about that? I think firstly, as the President said, there's no reason why you wouldn't want to know the cost. And if there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why your costs for something might be more expensive than an adjacent authority, that's something that you might want to address, because it's a saving, if you like, or it's an efficiency that's easily made. The second thing is that this set of indicators or benchmarks have been chosen because we feel, the Improvement Service, SOLAS and ourselves, that they are robust and that they are capable of stripping out the sort of variation that the explicable variation that you're talking about between authorities. Lastly, it's really important to appreciate that this is a way into a conversation as well about outcomes, so the benchmarks are not an end in themselves.
And they will be caveated, of course. John Pentland.
Chair, just to go back to the sort of media, I think it's regardless of how robust, local authority or COSLA are with regards to, the big strict approach. I find that, there'll always be a story there for somebody to, to use that stick against you, because on one hand, where you're embarking on a benchmarking exercise might show very clearly that a service either has to be withdrawn or improved then you know you're up for criticism one way or another. So, you know, I think that's probably somewhere down the road where, you know, I think I agree with you, Dave, we've got to be grown up, we've got to realise and recognise that you know, local authorities are not improving or taking away services just because they want to, because we're doing a benchmarking exercise. But with regards to the, I think we go back to, I think it was an earlier comment, David, where you had said that, and it's one that I agree with, that local authorities are primarily responsible for their own performance. And now, well, do you then believe that COSLA, do you believe that COSLA, the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, should have a role in supporting the implementation and operation of a benchmarking project? David?
Well, the people that local authorities are primarily responsible to and accountable to are their electorate. But across the whole of the public sector, there are agencies put in place, regulators appointed by either the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament. The Accounts Commission, Audit Scotland, for example, the Social Work Inspectorate, who monitor what we are doing, and they do the holding to account, if you like, on behalf of either Parliament or on behalf of the public. So it's right and proper that we engage with them in as full a way as we can. And as I said earlier, I mean, I had an off-the-line discussion, very brief discussion with the Chair of the Accounts Commission about what we were doing with benchmarking, and there has certainly been a change in attitude. I mean, I think that the Accounts Commission, Audit Scotland, are supportive of what we are trying to do here, and I think we are singing for the same hymn sheet currently.
Stewart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Just before I actually put the question, just a couple of quick comments. One is regarding Sweden, and both Councillor Neil and Councillor Cook spoke about Sweden earlier on. I studied in Sweden, so I absolutely agree with what you had to say regarding the country, and I think it's a model that certainly that we should be looking at more to learn from. The second comment is regarding the Councillor Neil. You said earlier that regarding politicians acting in a more mature manner. Good luck with that. I think after what the public have seen over the last week, I know certainly many members of the public have said to me that they've been really disappointed with how some politicians actually have acted. And I think Henry McLeish's comments last night on the Scotland Tonight programme.
Mr McMillan, I don't want to go into the debate of the last week's politics.
No, I'm now going to the question, Convener. I think just in terms of the benchmarking suite, there's one element of it actually I thought, I mean, all of it was extremely interesting, but one kind of point that kind of stood out for me, and that was the sickness absence days per employee. Now, I'm very much aware, obviously, with any action, there's always going to be a reaction. And it kind of ties in with a comment from the question from John Wilson earlier on regarding making sure you're actually taking people with you. It's not about imposing something upon the workforce, it's about making sure you're taking the workforce with you. And if, when on an annual basis, obviously, whether it's kind of the league tables or when information is actually published, if there is seen to be maybe an increase in the absence days, what type of activity would COSLA undertake to try to help a particular local authority and actually try to deal with this? I'm posing that question, also bearing in mind a comment that was made earlier on as well from Councillor Cook, that sometimes a postcode lottery is local democracy in action. So I fully appreciate that local authorities and local councils take decisions for the benefit of their area. But if there is a negative reaction to that, how would you actually, what would you actually do to assist to help?
Adam?
I can say a little bit about the absence management example in particular, because I think it is a good example of how you might use information to drive improvement. Absence management and data around about it is probably one of the most well-established areas of information that councils have been collecting for a number of years, and you can follow the trends quite closely over that period. It's also an area where councils will look very closely at the relative performance of other councils with a view to identifying what they're doing in terms of the application of their absence management policies that's driving that improvement. And there are a whole host of formal and informal benchmarking clubs, you might call them, that look at this issue in the kind of professional HR community. In terms of the interventions that might be made, really the focus is on improving attendance and health and well-being of the workforce. And what we've seen is those councils that have made perhaps the biggest improvements have had very active and robust policies round about health, attendance, and also making sure that they apply the absence management policy robustly and consistently across councils. But it is a very good example of where this kind of information can really drive improvement, and we've seen that in recent years.
Okay. Can I just add a political dimension to that helpful explanation that Adam's given? Is if I'm a politician in a council, and actually it so happens that my responsibility includes HR within the Scottish borders, and I look at our absence figures, and let's say they're 12 days per employee, but a council who is a comparator local authority, they're 9 days, I will want to challenge my managers as to why they're at that level of performance and we're not. What are the contextual factors behind that? Why are we in that position and they aren't? What are they doing differently in terms of their operational management approaches, which we aren't doing? That quite neatly, I think, demonstrates what this is principally about. We expect this to be used by the public, we expect it to be used by parliamentarians, we expect it to be used by the media, but who are we doing benchmarking for primarily? We're doing it so that we can get our internal processes right within councils to serve the public and to make sure that we're delivering as well as we can. That's the real objective that sits behind this.
Well, thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you. Final question. When does all of this go live? Barbara?
Yes, sorry. Everyone's looking at me. The intention is that it goes live later this year, and so figures would be published towards the end of the year.
Okay. Can I thank you very much for coming in today? I think that's been most enlightening. Can we suspend for 5 minutes until we change the seating for witnesses? Thank you.
Stewart, thanks for both your good ideas. We'll take them away.
Cheers. Our next panel of witnesses represent council leaders. Can I welcome Councillor Jim Fletcher, leader of East Renfrewshire Council, Councillor Ken Guild, leader of Dundee City Council, and Councillor Bill McIntosh, leader of South Ayrshire Council. Gentlemen, do you wish to make any opening remarks? Ken?
Okay, yeah.
Or Jim?
Who's first?
You go.
Okay.
You've got your light on.
Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me and colleagues along this morning. I would just perhaps make a very brief opening remark that certainly from my perspective and the perspective of East Renfrewshire Council, we very broadly welcome benchmarking. I suppose representing a council which was maybe a political creation and a small to medium-sized council, we're very alive to the fact that many people, certainly from the outset, felt we wouldn't cope with the big ticket items such as education, social work and whatever. So we always felt, and probably still feel, we have a point to prove. And the only way you can prove that you deliver those services well is by having some sort of evidence, and benchmarking provides that. So as a council, we've never really been afraid of benchmarking at all. I'm even relaxed about the political opposition having a go, because that's what politicians do, and I don't suppose we'll ever change the nature of that. So, and I'll be honest enough to say that I trade off good figures, so if we get good results from benchmarking, then of course, as the leader of the council and leader of the administration, I'm going to use that in my favour. And certainly even coming out of the last council election last year, I quite unashamedly campaigned in the fact that I believed we were a good council, and why would anybody want to cast a vote to change that? And I think that was largely successful. So, you know, I think living in the political reality, politicians will use whatever comes out of benchmarking for their own benefit. The only thing I would probably like and insist on is that whether it's MSPs, MPs or the press, is that rather than just go on a crude league table, at least the information should be fair. And I'll just give you one example to highlight it. If you looked at our recycling record in East Renfrewshire, I think we're now top of the league. We have the best recycling record in East Renfrewshire. But if you looked at our unit cost of collecting bins, we're probably one of the lower quartiles. So you could pick one of those stats and you could give us a gold star, or you could give us a black spot. But you have to look at these sort of things as a package. In other words, what we have done is we provide a weekly food waste collection, a weekly garden refuse collection. We heavily recycle and ask people to separate their plastics, their bottles, their tin cans and so forth. It works very well. It saves us a lot of money in landfill. As I say, we have excellent recycling rates, but it's not the most efficient way to actually collect the waste. But that's a political choice we take as councillors. So anybody looking at what we do in terms of waste collection and recycling needs to look at the whole package.
Okay. Ken? Thank you, Convener. I think the fact that the panel of local authority spokespeople this morning reflects a broad cross-section of the local councils does suggest that this committee realises that when it comes to benchmarking, one size does not fit all. There will be massive differences from one council to another, whether it's geographical, political, socio-economic, or whatever, so that these, whatever the results of the benchmarking, the important thing is that it has to be contextualised, that it's not simply raw statistics. And you may find it quite ironic that two councillors will speak rubbish one after the other, but we have in Dundee, at the moment, we have for many years had a waste-to-energy plant, which has had a slightly checkered career, but it is currently out of action after a major fire. Beforehand, we had one of the lowest landfill totals in the whole of Scotland, largely because we're the smallest footprint of any local authority in Scotland. We haven't got all that much land to fill, and we have to sort of buy land from our neighbouring councils. But at the moment, because the DERL is out of action for anything up to 9 months, we are actually bussing large truckloads of waste into neighbouring councils for disposal. So we're going to score very, very badly, I think, for the next 2 years in terms of waste disposal and cost of waste disposal. But I suspect that in 2 or 3 years' time, we will be pretty much at the top of the league again. So, I mean, these are things where, again, this is not going to be a simple snapshot. I think this is an ongoing process. And the interest will be, I think, not in the raw statistics I've said, but in how these statistics change in the various councils over a period of some years.
Thank you. Bill?
Thank you. I welcome benchmarking. I welcome anything that gives us something to compare. But I'd be disappointed if, when we get the benchmarking figures, we do anything other than confirm what we already know. We should know what we're good at and what we're bad at, not necessarily how good and how bad. One example, reading through the list of items here, one was housing voids. And we are doing quite poorly on that just now. We're well aware of it and we're targeting. But that is something that's mentioned almost on a daily basis and grilled by our own members and our own scrutiny panels. So we're looking at it. I think any council should be self-aware. There might be areas where we say, when we get the benchmarking figures, yeah, that's about where I thought we should be. But we then look and see, do we want to improve it? Or do we, for whatever priorities-based reasons locally, want to leave us where we are there and concentrate on certain other areas? So I think it's vitally important, and to have it as a sort of uniform level at national level is important, but I think it should be down to individual councils then to utilise it as one of the many tools that are going to help us move forward.
Thank you. 2 years to complete this project, a pretty long time. I wonder if you'd maybe like to comment on the length of time that it's taken to actually get us to where we are now. Jim?
Although the 2-year project, I think it's a good project to try and distill down to the key indicators. I mean, as councillors, we look at, by and large, 50 or so key indicators which are very much related to a single outcome agreement, and that's the right direction of travel. We used to get a raft of indicators before, and I don't think councillors ever read them in enough depth. I mean, you could spend a month or Sundays.
You never spent much time in Aberdeen City Council, Jim. I was the biggest anorak under the sun when it came to these figures, and there were many others. I think it's disappointing to hear that not many would read them all.
I think, well, certainly in my experience, councillors get reams and reams of performance indicators, and their eye is inevitably drawn to the negative ones. And okay, those are the things that you may give attention to, but I don't think you can give, if you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of performance indicators, I don't think you can give them all due weight. I think professionals can, in fields like education, where we've looked at exam results as a council, and councillors look at those in great detail, and we look at them in school by school, and professionals, I think, can use those detailed indicators to drive performance, and look for best practice across the board. But I just think for councillors to look at all the indicators for everything you do as a council, if you can distill them down and relate them to the single outcome agreement, that seems to be a much more productive way of going about it. And I think the piece of work that we're doing, if you like, driven by Solace and other organisations like COSLA and the Improvement Service, is the right direction of travel.
Ken?
Yeah, I think the main point of the exercise is to improve the level of public service to encourage best practice. And I don't think that's something you particularly want to rush. I mean, okay, it's taken us 2 years to get here, but I think we're now in quite a good place. What is happening here now is that these benchmarking points are actually going to be embedded in the day-to-day working of every department and every council in Scotland, and they will be the same benchmarks for each. Now, during a previous session there, a fair bit of attention was spent to external assessment Audit Scotland weren't mentioned by name, but I will mention them by name because I think we've had more visits from Audit Scotland than any other council in Scotland, I think largely because they don't like our committee structure. But what happens there is that senior management are taken away from the jobs that they are being paid to do by the public and expected to do by the public, to take part in lengthy meetings, lengthy seminars, lots of time preparing for these audits. And we sometimes get the impression that the report has almost been written before they arrive. I think that it's much better if you have something which is actually built in, which is open to scrutiny by yourselves, because you all know that this is a benchmark where every council is looking at the same things. But again, as I pointed out, it's not a case of one size fits all. So again, the differences between councils may very well have an impact on how the councils, each individual council, scores on each individual heading.
Thank you. Bill?
2 years is a long time, because I know that in the day job of being the council leader, it's frustrating how long it can take for so many things in a local authority to come to pass. There are 101 reasons for that. But the main thing I think in this particular one, if this is coming in, well, clearly it is coming in, let's make sure when it comes in and it's right. And I'm hoping that all the work that has been done and got us to this stage, and we heard earlier on from COSLA that we're hoping to introduce it this year. So let's get the show on the road and make it work. The 2 years is maybe unfortunate. It's the nature of the beast to an extent, but I tend to refer to the council and the real world, and there's somewhere a disparity at times, and we need to get better at that, because I do believe that running a council is like running a sizable business. And if you do that with business principles, then you start to improve the time frames. You start to have officers at all levels, starting at the top and moving down, starting to realise, yes, things can be done a wee bit more quickly than has been the case. So there's a culture change there. But the bottom line is, if I've got this right now, then I'm happy to have lived with the 2 years, and let's get the show on the road.
Thank you. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. You'll have heard some of the questions from the previous panel. How do you consider that you can build in ownership to both the staff at officer level and frontline services and the elected members, ownership of benchmarking so it becomes automatic in service management?
Who wants to take that first?
Jim? I hope we have a culture in the council where people are proud to work for our council, and people want to work for our council, because we have to work in partnership with our staff. I mean, in terms of dealing with trade unions or staff representatives, I operate a system where my door is always open. People can speak to me informally if there's issues that they want to discuss, and obviously we have our formal JCC meetings where all of those things are touched upon. If I use education as an example, where we really do drive our staff in education to deliver, and there's been some press comment that our staff are put under undue pressure. I don't think that's the case, but it's something that the Education Committee as a body does consider. The Director of Education and his staff are questioned quite thoroughly on that, and as I say, there are very good links to trade unions where if any individual member of the EIS teacher trade union colleagues wanted to speak about that, then the door is open to have that sort of dialogue. But there has to be a culture where I believe that the workforce understand that it's important that a council performs well, that staff there work efficiently, and that really comes down to, I think, good line management, good senior managers who can actually lead by example.
Thank you.
Ben?
Yeah, I think the term ownership, I think it's more responsibility, I think, rather than ownership, and it's very much a joint responsibility between elected members and officers at all levels. And certainly that is the way that we are approaching the whole benchmarking ethos. We do meet regularly with our senior management team and senior conveners. Our conveners are always in contact with the directors, and members of the administration, senior members of the administration, including myself, now sit in on a regular basis on management union meetings. So information is being passed. As my colleague has said, that the ethos of working for a council, trying to make a council better, I think that is an ethos that you'll find in virtually every local authority in Scotland. And the five of you who have been on councils before will probably realise that that is an ethos which exists in most councils.
I'm interested in that response particularly. For me, responsibility can be kind of double-edged sword. It can be a burden. Whereas ownership suggests more a voluntary, a willingness, an enthusiasm, perhaps, about the process. And I would just ask you, perhaps, to reflect on that.
Ken, do you want to comment on that?
I think the word I used was partnership, which I think suggests exactly that.
Okay, and Councillor McIntosh?
Yeah, I think frontline staff want to do well. They know when things aren't working. You need to ensure there's a good communications. There's no point in having frontline staff who are good at their job and for whatever reason not being empowered to do it. They have to be able to go to the next in line and say, I'm not happy with this, because so it's very much the communications up, down and across. We can easily say, we get this report and we say, we're not happy with this, we need to do something about it, and that filters down, and the senior manager will talk to the middle manager, and they will have a staff meeting and tell them. That's fine, but it's a whole buy-in. It really is bottom up as the start of the thing. As I said earlier on, if we're doing it right, benchmarking should only confirm how we feel about ourselves anyway. We should know. And we can't know how good or bad we are if we're not empowering that person in the front line to say, this is not how you should empty bins or give out benefit payments or whatever. And it's that basic level. And if we are communicating with staff, and I think we're doing it quite well. I won't pretend for a minute we're 100%, it probably never will be 100%, but we're driving that down. When we took over in the council 5 years ago, we hadn't had a staff survey for 7 years. Now, that's just an example of what not to do. We now have those regularly, and we don't always get the answers we want, but that improves, shows that we are improving, and staff are willing to talk. So it's about facilitating it for them to be able to say, this isn't right, and for the manager to take it on board and eventually come back to us and say, look, we can't help that girl or boy in the front line because we don't have enough staff or money or whatever.
I think you've identified an important factor in communication. I think in any organisation that success is paramount on just how much or how successful and good the communication and the lines of communication are. You've all identified it can be a change to create this culture of buying into benchmarking. Could each of you perhaps say what you consider to be the biggest challenge within your local authority and the role that you play in trying to persuade both officers and other elected members to buy into it?
Ken, do you want to start off with that one?
Well, we were in a slightly strange position as an administration. We took over in mid-term in 2009. And two months later, we had a new chief executive. So we had a new administration, a new chief executive, very little baggage. And so we more or less saw this as a blank sheet. And we agreed with the chief executive. We said have a changing of the future board, which would meet. It would invite members from all groups along. The other groups all boycotted it because they thought that if they were coming along to that and discussing and agreeing, this thing had no decision-making powers, but agreeing with concepts, that they would somehow be dragged into our decisions, and if these decisions proved to be wrong, then they would be tarred with the same brush. That is the I suppose, the inbuilt attitude which I would most like to see changing.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Jim?
Thanks. I don't think as a council we've had too many problems in actually getting people to buy into that agenda of continuous improvement or people failing to understand why the council needs to perform well. We don't have huge numbers of staff leaving. and there seems to be quite a number of staff that would like to work for East Renfrewshire. So that suggests to me that the overall ethos is right and is a positive one. I do speak to the political opposition, and my line is always, I don't mind you criticising the council, don't mind you criticising me, and if we're getting something wrong, by all means you give us a kick. But don't just criticise the council and look for failure, and as an organisation, and don't say anything publicly that would actually denigrate East Renfrewshire as an organisation. Keep it at a political level. But if you don't think that we are running it properly, politically, by all means have a go. But don't go into these websites and all the rest of it that are around just to kind of run down the council. And I think that's just a bit of a wider approach to your council. I would hope that every councillor in East Renfrewshire, irrespective of the party or none, because we have independent councillors as well, feel a pride in East Renfrewshire Council and want that council to be successful. And, I was the first Labour councillor elected to the Old Eastwood District Council, which was effectively 100% Conservative run at that point. But it didn't mean that you shouldn't have a pride in that council. And I just think that's the overarching, message that you need to get across.
Okay, thank you.
Bill, please.
Thank you. I think you're so right there, Jim, in the pride in the council. It goes back to what I said earlier about the frontline staff. They want to deliver good services. So selling benchmarking to elected members is no bother, because we're already on a daily basis hypercritical of just about everything we do, to a point of silliness at times. But nevertheless, that's the nature of the beast. So even within my own political group, which is the largest in the council, we have my own group members criticising some of the stuff we do, and that probably gets louder as we go out with the political group. And then when it gets to our scrutiny panels, they're ready to tear the whole thing apart, which is right and proper. So I don't see any problem with the buy-in for benchmarking as another useful tool. And how we sell that tool, it's not, I think one of your own members said, there's no point in saying to staff, here's another tool, it's called benchmarking. That's pointless. It's how do we relate to that frontline member of staff. If it says here that we are in the middle when we want to be near the top, not necessarily at the top, but we want to be near the top, how do we do it? The message has to go down politically to management, all the way down to that frontline member of staff who can say and make a contribution. I think we could help by doing this or that or the other. Or we might need to say to them, we need to look at working practices, change how we do it. But as far as I'm concerned, I really don't have a problem at all in the ability to have buy-in for benchmarking, if it's going to enable us to have that pride, as you said, that we all feel in our councils.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Stewart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. I just want to explore a little bit about the 47 indicators or so, it depends how you count them, that there are, a proportion of which are measuring the inputs, and a somewhat larger proportion which are seeking to identify the outcomes. And I just wonder to what extent you've been involved in and are satisfied that the people in Solace have come up with a set of input measures that are actually going to help you identify if you're making the longer distance journeys to the outcomes that you seek. And generally how useful you think this list is going to be, which is of course not your list, it's the list that's been provided to you.
Bill first, please.
Okay. In terms of course, one here, cost of visits to libraries. I suppose geography comes into that for an example. But there are ones that I picked on that were particularly relevant to my own council. One is the percentage of rent due in the year that was due to voids. And that's an issue, and we're improving on that. But there's another interesting one, percentage of repairs completed within target times. Now, we have a target of responding to every housing repair within 4 hours. Now, that's wonderful. Is it too wonderful? Because you can't get a plumber or a joiner or anybody when you want one. You're lucky if you get them to turn up on the day they'll come. But out there in the real world, you're going to have to wait maybe a day. Lucky if you're in an emergency, you'll get somebody. Should we be looking at that? So it might be that because we have that 4 hour target, we might not be doing as well and meeting it as somebody who says we'll go out within 24 hours. So you need to think at that. We might decide when the figures come in, yeah, we still want to stick to the 4 hours, and that's okay. That might leave us in a place on the benchmarking marker where you, as a committee, might think we're not doing as well. That's where the local thing comes in. I feel that overall, having looked at it, we need to suck it and see. And it might well be that as we do put it into operation, it might need tweaked. We can't put hand in heart even after 2 years and say it's right. But I do feel, having looked at it, that yeah, it does seem to have targeted the right areas.
Ken?
Yes, largely happy with the points that have been raised, because this was done through SOS. It was also discussed at COSLA leaders, so that the leaders of the various councils had an opportunity to input. If they didn't like what was there, then they had an opportunity to input. The important thing is that it is outcome-led, and I think it's the outcomes which are all important. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, one size doesn't fit all. There's a tremendous range of structures within the local authorities in Scotland. We, for example, have a Director of Education. We thought that was the best way to approach it. But other councils have a Director of Children's Services, which will include education and aspects of social work. So they arrive at these outcomes through different routes, but the important thing is that the outcome actually works, that the outcome is achievable. And I think what is happening with these benchmarking is that it enables you to work out whether councils are producing the services that they are required to produce at an acceptable level, rather than how they go about producing it. And I think that is probably the correct way to approach it.
Thank you. Jim, please.
I would broadly agree with that. I mean, as I said earlier, I think we had too many performance indicators to manage them properly. And I think the piece of work that's been done to distill them down to the 50 or so, or 47, whatever the figure is a good piece of work. And I haven't heard anybody, either within my own council or going through to COSLA from other councils, actually say that these indicators are wide of the mark. So I think the people that have produced them, largely driven by Sol as chief executives, are wise individuals. They know their business, and I do think these indicators are really very robust. I think the one fallback to that you need to remember, and those of you who've been councillors will be very alive to it, councillors are very close to their community. You probably still get the scars of going to community groups, community councils, tenants associations, residents associations and such like. If there's anything wrong in the community, councillors are the first port of call for people to complain. So, you know, you are very alive to what's going on in your local area. You pick it up very quickly. So if there was something, if you felt something was wrong that wasn't being picked up by the indicator, as the local councillor, you would know about it right away.
I have to say, as MSPs, we also get scars. John, were you wanting to come in a supplementary on that point?
Very briefly on that panel, a number of times, Jim, you've mentioned performance indicators, and obviously, you know, the eye will automatically go to where any council's least performing. This is probably a question for each and every one of you there. If that indicator shows that you're underperforming, do you take that seriously, or do you take into account what the unit price or indeed the affordability of improving on that indicator before you take action on it?
Jim? I'll come in that in the sense that we absolutely take it seriously. If there's criticism of the performance indicator, you're right, you need to look at it to find out if the criticism is valid. But if the criticism is valid, then you need to do something about it. And that's the catalyst for putting your hand up and saying, yeah, this needs to improve and we'll do it better. Not every council gets everything right. It's impossible to be the best council in Scotland at everything. All councils will do different things well and other things less well. So the things you do it less well, you need to put your hand up, learn from it, and actually go out and look at other councils, look at best practice, learn from it and improve.
Bill?
I would agree with that. No council wants to be performing poorly in anything. Any negative performance indicator will be looked at I will, in all these screeds of papers that do come our way, I will go through and I'll be circling numerous ones that I'll then discuss next time I meet with the Chief Exec, for example. He will have his response and it will filter down. It will, as I said earlier, go to scrutiny panels, etc. Individual councillors want all of these to move from negative into positive territory. They can't all be done. There'll be good reasons why some of them can't be done. But if it can be done, let's do it. And I'm quite sure that I would speak for all three of us when I would say that in each council there is the political will to improve any of the negative indicators.
Ken?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if a council is performing poorly, it has an adverse effect on the morale, not just of the voters, but of the council-elected members and the council employees. It's in the interest of everyone to continue to try to improve performance. And certainly all our departmental reports and departmental plans will have a list of the performances. And if the performance is below par, then there is also an explanation given that contextualises it. And the elected members are then free to question at committee the relevant senior officers. And so the performance indicators are taken very, very seriously indeed, and they're used as part of the day-to-day running of the council. As far as the liaising with other councils and improving ideas. For example, I had a team of our senior officers went to Renfrew this Monday and spent the day with them, getting ideas from them and giving them ideas on what we're doing. And this is part of a series of like visits. So we're not just, I mean, obviously we liaise very closely with our neighbouring councils, and in fact we have partnership working with them on a number of areas, but we're also looking at other councils where we think we can learn and where perhaps we can give them pointers as well. So we're very much bought into this idea of improving service right across the country.
Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Convener. And let me absolutely agree with Jim. If you want to know what's going on in the community, and I'm sure many other MSPs, first call the councillor, find out what's going on. I wonder if the panel might care to comment on what I'm about to say, because I'm getting this slight impression that each of you in varying degrees sees benchmarking as an add-on to your existing internal measures of how you're doing. Because I would expect every council to be looking at what you're doing, measuring, counting, responding to that, and Bill said he highlights things on reports. Is it not surely the case that benchmarking is actually something quite different? It is actually a tool to enable you to identify opportunities that others are showing you of improving, rather than being another way of measuring what you're doing internally. And furthermore, if you were to look at it in those terms, is that not a more engaging way for staff at every level in the council? Because I also have heard some slightly disturbing suggestions, that it percolates its way down, and I haven't heard too much about the percolating back up. Whether benchmarking is something different than perhaps I've been hearing.
Jim?
I would say in East Renfrewshire we've used it as a tool to actually drive performance, and if I take education as an example, I can think of areas, mathematics, when East Renfrewshire was set up, we didn't perform as a council particularly well in mathematics. Modern languages is another example. You look at that and you look at how you can drive the performance. As a council, we are grouped with similar councils in Scotland. The HMIE would have grouped you in a certain banding. For ourselves, I think it's Midlothian, East Lothian, Stirling, Aberdeenshire and Eastern Bartonshire. Well, when we looked at those benchmarks, Eastern Bartonshire did particularly well in mathematics. So you ask the obvious question, why can Eastern Bartonshire outperform East Renfrewshire? So quietly, officers go out there, you have that frank discussion in your mathematics departments, and the teachers, the principal teachers go out to Eastern Bartonshire and they look and they learn and they find out what they're doing in that authority, which is different and probably better than you're doing in your own authority. So I honestly think it is used as a way to drive performance.
So would I be right then in characterising it, in your council at least, as a positive encouragement to improve rather than a negative comment on performance?
Absolutely, and I think it's important that you don't demonise an area that's performing less well. The
has opportunities for improvement.
Absolutely, yes.
Ken?
Yeah, I think as I think I mentioned earlier, that we see this as a means of embedding it into the process, and rather than relying on an external assessments, if you like, that this is part of the day-to-day working of the council. And certainly, again, you're talking about the best practice and so on, and the willingness to compare with others. If I go back to the Monday's visit, one of the reasons they visited Renfrew was that, like Dundee, Renfrew had recently moved out of a tower block into a new council headquarters. And in both cases, the councils had taken the opportunity to open one-stop shops for the public, to get immediate access to officers. And I think a lot was learned by comparing what we do there, instead of the rather depressing waiting rooms we had in various buildings throughout the city. We now have a large open area where there are floor walkers meeting those who are there for the first time, don't know the way around, and they are then directed to the appropriate desks and to the appropriate people who can help them. And we've had very positive feedback on this, and what I've been hearing from the officers, Renfrew have been doing very much the same. And so what we're doing here is we're comparing and we're reinforcing, we're looking at ways of improving the service. And that's frontline service, that's impacting on the public directly.
Oh, please.
In a way, I think it's a useful add-on. In South Ayrshire, I would say we've had a form of benchmarking for a number of years now. When we took over the council in 2007, it had a history of neglect and mismanagement, which was just coincidentally at that particular time identified by Out Scotland. And we had a less than rosy best value report. But we had to work very closely with them and still do. But they were useful and are still useful, because even before this comes in, they're working, they have the national picture that we don't have. And they can say, well, look, we see that your overall property costs are X%, whereas the norm for your comparator councils would be Y%. So we've already had that. So in reading these proposals that are coming forward, this was the sort of thing I was expecting to see anyway, because we've been used to working in that sort of environment. And take it as a positive add-on. Add-on sounds flippant, and it's not in any way flippant. It's a valuable add-on to the tools that we have. But again, we look at them. I don't see it as necessarily an indicator where I and my council would be saying, right, we must go aim for the top in all of those. For a start, we might well not have the financial resources to do it. And the financial resources are a challenge just now and will be an ever-increasing challenge. So we need to decide what's best for the people in our area. That's the political decision that will be made. We will prioritise and allocate our funding accordingly, within the parameters, obviously, of the national requirements and the national agenda. But I do see it as an add-on where the term can opener was used, and you look at it and say, right, we're not, on the face of it, we're not looking good there. Why is that? And we drill down, assess why that is, and then we make the decision, are we comfortable with that, or do we want to do something about it? And if we do want to do something about it, then we'll act accordingly.
Thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
I'm going to ask you a question about the community planning partnerships and how you think, well, if you'd have been listening to the panel this morning, they had some good advice, But what particular challenges of applying the benchmarking approach to the community planning partnership, especially in terms of the contribution to the delivery of outcomes?
Ken, do you want to start off this time, please?
Yeah, we take the community planning partnerships very, very seriously indeed, and we do have the Dundee partnership, which is chaired by myself, which involves the various local government departments, the police, the fire service, the 2 universities, the local college, and a number of charities, community organisations, and so on. We also have 8 local community planning partnerships based on each of the 8 wards in the city. Each one of these is chaired by a member of the senior management team, and we get the feedback at grassroots level. And instead of that just being lost in the system, because they're chaired by a member of the senior management team, that is fed straight back into the organisation at senior management level, and the ward councillors also attend the local community planning partnerships. So we're getting the information at grassroots level.
Jim, please.
We've approached community planning in a slightly different fashion from other councils. Historically, we had the same sort of meeting, which would be familiar to many people, where you met quarterly, people exchanged reports, there was a tick in the box, police, fire, enterprise, SPT, you name it, they all turned up, you tick in the box, and that was community planning partnership. What we've tried to do is embed it in people's jobs, almost as part of their job description. So it's very much done at officer level. People in their day-to-day jobs and their tasks are working towards these agreed outcomes through the single outcome agreement. And part of that is dealing with all our community planning partners. So what we're trying to do is get an interface on a day and daily basis, very much focused on a single outcome agreement. The challenge in that for elected members is actually getting elected members to engage with that, because a lot of that's going on and is not necessarily visible to elected members. What we've tried to do is have a number of seminars, usually before we have a full council meeting, again involving all our community planning partners, and we will take a particular topic. It could be child poverty, it could be deprivation, it could be, you know, any particular topic we want to look at, and we invite all our community planning partners to be there, and we make sure, because it's almost there as part of our full council meeting, that all our councillors engage in that. But I have to say, in terms of actually delivering the outcomes in the single outcome agreement, what we're trying to do is get away from this idea of just a meeting, but very much you know, mainline it in people's jobs.
Thank you. Bill, please.
I think the important word in community planning is community. And if I'm honest, I would say that although I'm not happy with how we do community planning, but I'm assured that we're a lot better than my perception of it. We're not at the top, but we're doing well, which is fine. But I see it largely as we're on the council, and in parallel, we're on community planning. With the whole new, we're waiting on the national guidance on community planning for the new single outcome agreements to be brought in next spring. But as far as I'm concerned, and I've been saying for some time now, that community planning will become the day job. It's not the council doing what the council does. It's integrating the whole thing. So it's involving our partners, but it's also involving the communities. I've been out talking to community councils and associations of community councils and putting that message across. They are going to be fundamental in the delivery of services. We have to make sure that they have the resources, because the millions of pounds that we're spending each year will still be spent. It's not enough to say, right, there's £1 million to you in the community, on you go, and I hope you do well. We need to resource them and make sure that they're up for the task. Otherwise, we're not defending that public pound in the way that we are at the moment. So there are challenges there, but as far as I'm concerned, it's the community that's going to make it work. There are some communities probably more up for it than others, and there's no point in empowering a community that's not up to the challenge. They've got to want to be involved in it, and if they are, then it'll work. So as far as I'm concerned, it is all about the community, but we're working against a tight time frame in making this work. And I'm very aware just now there's a lot on in the agenda for local authorities in terms of community planning, welfare reform, social work and health integration, a whole raft of big ticket items coming forward just now. My own feeling is when this comes in for councils, it's probably too early for it to be coming in for community planning because it's in this transformation process just now. My own feeling would be, let's look at the first year of this working for councils and then look at it coming in for community planning, because at the moment, community planning, we're still working on what that's going to be. Until we get the national guidance, we can't really take it much further at the moment. Once we get that, it's all systems go to make it work, but only when it's working, I think, would it be meaningful to then say, right, let's benchmark that. And I think at that time, it's absolutely correct that we do benchmark, because you've got a whole new system in place, and that's an ideal time to start assessing it.
Anne?
Just a tiny wee thing. Bill, you had mentioned there about community councils. You emphasised community councils. What other means would you or do you do currently to encourage the community members to become involved?
We have 3 main groupings of community councils in Ayrshire, where just geographically you've got maybe the rural area in the south and the towns in the middle and other bits, and just by natural geography, they have come together. So, as well as being one of our community councils, they're also very much a part of that wider community. Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to that, you have, Girvan's a good example, there's a lot of good stuff going on in Girvan just now. We have a town team, we have another organisation, I forget all the names, but there are maybe half a dozen good organisations. There are business associations or whatever. Part of the challenge will be that I don't think councils are resourced or particularly should be feeding out to all of these organisations. I think for it to be more effective, it might be that we identify one main organisation in a locality. It might be a community council, but in another area it might be something else. And that becomes the organisation that feeds into council, and the council feeds into and supports and uses as the main local resource. In that sense, you maybe need to look at how then to bring in the other organisations that are doing good work. I don't think it would work just to go out to every organisation, because I don't think they would all have the resource, and I don't even know that we would have the resource to resource all of them to make it work.
The convener had mentioned in the earlier session, you know, we believe and we've taken evidence that community planning partnership works best if it has the community at heart and the community members are involved within that.
We have 2 community members on our community planning board. They've been on about 3 years as council leader now, and they've been on since before me. Now, that will need to continue, but in what way that will continue, I can't answer you just now because we're still in this transitionary period. But that is, it's going to be vital. And I'm not going to give you an answer just now because I say I'm still getting my head around it. And until we get this guidance, we're not really going much further forward at the moment. I understand that's due in a week or so, and that will give us a chance to move forward. But as far as I'm concerned, I've been going out there, I put my head on the block, I've been going out to all the community organisations, basically saying, you guys will be at the centre of whatever this is going to be.
And do you want to come back on that point?
I would like to come back in. The mention of community councils, and I mentioned before the start that we have quite a broad range of councils here today. They're very different in their character. And in Dundee, we have 2 community councils. And that is not unusual in urban councils. There is perhaps no sort of coincidence that the 2 community councils exist in the only 2 wards that don't have any areas of multiple deprivation. What you find is that the community councils tend, certainly in our area, to attract a certain type of individual. So what we've done is we've included in the partnership, and certainly in the local community planning partnership, various tenants groups, self-help groups who are operating at grassroots level, and which we feel is absolutely necessary. They feed into the process. So although in ones with perhaps rural areas community councils seem to work best in small towns or communities which have a very strong sense of identity. And that's not always the case in urban areas where there's big population drift and high population turnover. So for that reason, we do invite the community councils along and they do take part, but there are other community groups which perhaps in an urban setting have more of an input to the planning partnership.
Okay. Well, I'll let Jim in and then I'll take you back on. Jim?
I wouldn't necessarily agree with Ken and his experience of community councils. I mean, we are an urban area, and I mean, I've got 2 community councils in my ward, you know, let alone the whole council. What we've done, I mean, we sometimes do get complaints from community councils that they're not fully engaged with the community planning process. As an example, as a council, we take on interns. We have high levels of graduate unemployment because we have a lot of people coming out of schools, good qualifications, get their degree, can't get a job. So we have this scheme where we try and take them on in the council for 3 to 6 months, pay them the minimum wage, and we do packets of work which are obviously not part of the day-and-day daily work of the council. In other words, it's something we would look to get some added value, and the trade unions are happy with that. So one of the ideas was to say to the Community Council Giffnock, as it happens in my ward, very active community council who were critical of that, their inability to affect the outcome of community planning, to actually get the intern to do a piece of work for the community council, just to actually find out how those group of individuals can engage more meaningfully. So I think there's a willingness in councils to do that. But I think a lot of communities are kind of floundering about just how they themselves can influence the process.
Anne, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, it's not that I'm wanting to knock community councils. I would be interested to hear what all 3 councillors do have to say about what have they put out to encourage other community members to become involved in the benchmarking process and community planning partnerships. But I don't need to hear that today if they want to write that in.
Gentlemen, if you could provide that information to the committee in writing, that would be useful. Or if you can give very brief answers, then again, please feel free to do so. I think that's a right in there.
That's grand.
Stewart McMillan.
You're looking for a wide range of community groups and how we approach them.
Yeah, I think it's the committee, in terms of not only this investigation but others into community planning, are very interested in finding out which community organisations and bodies are represented in community planning partnerships. And if we could get that, and I know that there will be a number, if you can write that in, that would be very useful to us. Thank you, Anne. Stewart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. I've got a question regarding obviously kind of one of the suite points, and this is it's probably not going to be an easy question to answer, and it's maybe will be more of a kind of hypothetical question in terms of what might happen. But kind of one of the points on the back page of what's been provided, the council, the current tenants arrears as a percentage of net rent due point. Obviously, with events that are going to be out with your control and your local authorities' control. Councillor McIntosh, you touched upon the welfare reform earlier. And also with welfare reform activities going to take place, I would imagine that there will be an effect upon some of these indicators, and that one in particular. And as a consequence of that, what would yourselves, what could you do? And also what what options are there for you to really kind of get across what may actually be kind of negative points that may come out from each of your authorities, but also across all 32 in Scotland. How do you get a message across that actually this isn't, it's not something that's our making, it's something that's actually happened from elsewhere?
Gentlemen, without straying too much into welfare reform, but the benchmarking, well, what will happen with the benchmarking figures because of some of the changes that there will be?
If I can come in, I think that welfare reform is just something that we have to handle. Whether it's coming from Edinburgh or something, London, it's coming from London. Once that decision is made at a higher political level, we are there to implement it and make it work. We can spend all day criticising or not, but that's irrelevant. The reality is...
I don't want to spend any time whatsoever in criticism. I think that's for another place. I would love to sit here all day and criticise the Westminster Government for this, but that's not what we're here for today,
That's exactly right. So what I'm saying is that we are here to implement it, and we have to implement it as best we can. For example, one example of the welfare reform proposals is that if a tenant is deemed to be in accommodation that is too big for their needs, they can be involved in a reduction in their housing benefit. Now, the knock-on effect for that, we're anticipating...
I'm going to stop you, Councillor McIntosh, because at the end of the day, we're getting into welfare reform and all of the different things. We are here to talk about benchmarking. There will be an impact on these stats because of welfare reform. What I don't want to do is to get into all of the ins and outs of welfare reform today. No, so if you can concentrate on the stats and the actual effects that there will be, please.
Okay, I was trying to illustrate that point, but okay, I'll take that on board, Chair. And yes, those stats we would expect will change. As people's circumstances do alter, we will have to, that will be reflected in the stats that come forward. And I would expect that if mine go down, these two gentlemen will go down too, so it's maybe a level playing field, maybe not, depending on the individual circumstances, but we will assess that and monitor that, because again, as I said earlier, with benchmarking, it should always tell me what I already know, confirm it in a comparator indicator, but we should already know that things that we're getting better at that, or because of legislation we're getting worse at something. So that really doesn't matter. This will reflect the changing trend. But what's important then is what have we done in the meantime to analyse it and to plan for it, and how do we handle it.
Jim, please.
See before Jim comes in, Stewart, on that point, in terms of the important thing is about what you're doing now to plan. What actually are you doing?
I'm sorry, we're not going along that line today, because at the end of the day we're getting into the realms of welfare reform, which another committee of the Parliament is looking at. We're here to discuss benchmarking at this moment in time. There will be other opportunities for this committee to discuss the impact of welfare reform and local government, I'm sure, but today we're looking at benchmarking. Councillor Fletcher.
Of course, the impact in welfare reform will have a very real and drastic effect in councils and on our performance and on those figures that you will no doubt be considering over the next few years as part of the benchmarking. What we are, as a council, the way we are approaching it, we, as part of our budget deliberations, are trying to work out what we need to put into all our customer first, our money advice service, how much we need to give to our citizens' advice partners and so forth to deal with that. So that obviously has a fairly major impact on our budget and how we're going to deal with that. I have to say there's very clever language that comes out from Scottish Government, which I've objected to at COSLA, so it's no great secret that we have a shared problem here. And, we contribute money to the social fund and whatever, and there's clearly an expectation from John Swinney's letter to councils that councils contribute from their budget to that. Well, we don't have the money for it. I feel that
again, we're straying, and I don't want to stray into this realm, because the counter-argument is that the Scottish Government doesn't have the money to mitigate all of these things either. I don't want to get into this today. We're here to deal with benchmarking, gentlemen. Please stick to it, because we've got limited time to deal with this.
I understand that, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are financial pressures which are here on councils now, and as part of that, frankly, it will be a political decision. We will have to sit down as an administration, in our council it's a Labour and SNP administration, and decide if we're going to take some of our budget to mitigate against the effects of it.
Councillor Fletcher, I'm trying to stick to benchmarking here. I could sit here for hours and talk welfare reform. I'm on the committee. I don't want to do that today, because we're here for a specific purpose. Ken Gill, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is something which all our figures are going to look a lot poorer as this kicks in. And this is where, again, I get back to the point I made right at the beginning. The raw statistics may not mean a thing. It's putting it into context. You have other indicators there, for example, percentage of rent due in the year that's lost due to voids. That's something which we inherited in our council. We had one of the worst voids records in the country, and one of the worst relet records. And that is something which we latched onto right away. And we have spent the last few years addressing that fact. And as a result, our voids are now less than half of what they were. And our relet system, which has been completely revamped, giving 3 strikes and you're out choices to new tenants for housing stock which had not been repaired or brought up to standard to relet, was not the way to do it. And we have completely revamped our relet and voids policy. So that's the sort of thing which I think we can do something about, and that's the sort of statistics which will actually mean something, rather than something, a similar statistic, or an apparently similar statistic, which is beyond our control.
Stuart Stevenson, please.
I really just wanted to come in because I think we're talking about the numbers and not about benchmarking. In other words, if everybody goes down,
yep,
the relativities remain unchanged, you know, if they go down equally. Whereas benchmarking, and I invite you to agree or disagree, is about, on the way down, if that's the way it's going, still using the opportunities to say, actually, somebody else is handling it better and we can learn from them. Is that the approach that you're going to take? And since Ken said everybody's going down together, generically, perhaps he might respond.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm looking at here is, I did make the point that everyone's going down together. Is it a reflection on the councils that this is going down, or is it a reflection on some other place? And remember, we're not just talking about figures here. At the risk of straying in, and I'm sure the chair will tell me if I am, we are going to have a lot of additional voids due to rent, and I think we're talking about personal problems for other people here rather than how the council looks.
I don't want to stray into that because we're getting to the same position that we were earlier. I know what... Stuart, do you want to repeat that, what you said? Because I think that point we need to get to grips with.
I really did want to just get the point across that benchmarking is a neutral tool that works whether everybody's improving, everybody's deteriorating. It hopefully, you're all going to view it as something that reveals to you opportunities for improving in a relativistic sense. And I just feel it would be useful to hear your comments on that. And I think Bill's dying to come in.
I think Bill is dying to come in.
I'm just trying to think how I can say it without being red-carded. Simply to make the point that I'm in South Ayrshire and up the road is North Ayrshire. And on the housing side of the welfare reform, there's an impact that will be significant in my council and will be non-existent in that council. So to that extent, without saying any more, that makes it a less than level playing field.
But will benchmarking help you to pick up from what you might deem comparable councils opportunities to better mitigate the effects of a difficult circumstance? That's the fundamental question about what we're talking about today, which is benchmarking.
Yeah, that I will identify that particular issue as an issue that my council has to address. Benchmarking, in due course when it comes out for that particular measurement, should confirm where I think I am. It'll give me an indication where I am against others. And because of a particular issue, I might expect that, in that example, I might be down there compared to North Ayrshire, for example. But that might be acceptable for reasons that I'll not say.
I'm sorry to press the point, but what I really want to hear, or I may not hear, you may say I'm off the mark, that you will actually see benchmarking as helping you find the answer outside the boundaries of your own talent, expertise, experience and numbers. You know, because if benchmarking doesn't do that, I'm not sure it's got a huge purpose.
I think we may fail if it doesn't do that. Bill?
I can't answer that just now. I don't know, but an interesting one to watch. I don't think we can assume that benchmarking will give the answer. I would need to say I'd need to wait and see.
So therefore, I'm sorry, Convener, Does that... I've got a thread through your evidence, Councillor McIntosh, that perhaps you're one of the benchmarking sceptics at the moment. Because I think that's the essence of what you're saying, that it's not...
No, that's, sorry, Chair, that's contrary to what I've said on a number of instances today. I started off by saying I welcome benchmarking. I see it as another useful add-on. I see it as confirmation. Hopefully, if I'm doing my job right, hopefully it will confirm that I am mid-range, now on top or down at the bottom. So I'm sorry if, for some reason, all those positive comments have come out as a negative reaction to benchmarking, because it's not.
No, I'm just...
I think we should move on.
I think I'll leave it, Convener. I'll leave it, Convener.
Do any of the other gentlemen want to make a comment on what Mr Stevenson has said?
The only, perhaps one comment I would make is that obviously the impact will affect councils differently. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the effect in, let's say, the southeast of England, where there's higher house prices in terms of housing benefit, I suspect the impact in East Renfrewshire might be more akin to some of those areas in the southeast of England, whereas obviously some of the areas, maybe Dundee is one of them, might have more of an impact in terms of social housing and whatever. We do need to learn from elsewhere, but you know, I don't think any of us wouldn't use benchmarking to learn from good practice.
Again, I would agree. I don't know exactly what role benchmarking would play here, because as I think Mr McMillan, when he couched the original question, said that a lot of this will be beyond the control of the councils. And as Jim has just said, a lot will depend on the percentage of residents in a particular council area who are already on low pay or on social benefit. So I think that will have as much impact on the figures as anything which a council is doing to try to allay the situation.
Very briefly on this point, Margaret Mitchell.
I think the point the committee is trying to get over is, regardless of where these pressures have come from, as a result of benchmarking, if you look at the data there, you realise that your council has potentially a problem. Can you use the benchmarking from throughout Scotland to identify another council that seems to be addressing the issue, and then use that as an opportunity to see if you can learn from it and maybe get some answers to the problem?
Very briefly, yes, no answers if possible. Ken?
That's a hypothetical question.
I don't think so.
Jim?
Yes, we would do it, but it is new. Everybody is in a learning curve, but of course you would look to learn from best practice elsewhere.
Oh.
One word response, absolutely.
John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just a brief question to ask the panel, and good morning, panel. Looking at the COSLA report that we received as part of the evidence for today's session, Section 8 refers to the fact that the SOLAS pulled together the suite of the benchmarking suite during 2010-11. It was agreed in August 2011. The suite was then put to the Directors of Finance of local authorities, and they came back between February and May and they said, right, that looks fine. The question I would like to put to the panel today is, has there been any approach by the Chief Executive or the Director of Finance to say that they need additional staffing resources to be able to pull together the information required in terms of the benchmarking suite, and whether or not there has been any discussion regarding the preparation and presentation of these outcomes by local authorities, because this benchmarking suite does not come out without any additional resources having to be put into it. And has that been discussed between the council leaders, council chief executives and Director of Finance?
Ken?
Dundee, yes, it certainly has. We've been discussing this for quite some time, and the answer is no, they are not putting forward extra staff or suggesting that they should, because this is already embedded in what they're doing. What did cause us extra was, as I've mentioned earlier, external assessments that were coming in where we had to divert staff away from the normal duties. Preparing the information for benchmarking is built in, it's embedded in the jobs that they're already doing.
Jim?
I would agree with that. We've always looked at performance indicators. I've certainly not been asked for any additional resources in terms of the new way of looking at the 50. So indicators that we tend to, or benchmarking indicators that we look at now. It's just part and parcel of what councils do, and I would expect officers just to prepare the information properly to the relevant committee or cabinet or whatever.
Bill?
I'm the same, it's just been incorporated in what we do.
Very briefly, do you think that this may actually save you your officers some time and money, the fact that these indicators have been reduced compared to some of the other things that you had in the past? And would you expect the audit bodies, whichever one it may be, to take account of these new suite of indicators as they deal with future audit? Briefly, Ken?
I certainly hope they will.
Okay, Jim?
Yes, we used to have drafter papers that think we'll save a forest.
Bill?
Yeah, and I think the audit bodies most certainly will be using it.
Okay, thank you. John, do you want to come back? John Pentland, please.
From me, obviously, you heard at the last panel there, obviously the benchmarking data being publicised, and which could probably lead to a league table, and the worst councils being identified. Do you believe that that could be better managed, and do you also believe that maybe some support should be given from other organisations as how best you approach that?
Bill, please.
I don't see any particular need for external support. Yeah, we all get bad press, that's part of the job. We need to be putting out the good news stories throughout the year on the good things that are happening, if for no other reason than that our own staff read it, because they need to know that we're appreciating what they're doing. We need the local communities to appreciate what's being done. So when benchmarking or any other audit type report or whatever comes out, they will immediately home in on negativity. The comments made earlier about the up, down and sideways arrows might help focus it a bit, but I don't see any particular need for external assistance on that at this stage.
Jim, please.
I think if an organisation wants it, I mean, there are instances where councils have had very poor best value audits, and there's been a team of experts, for want of a better term, going in to help, largely led by COSLA, and these things have serious ramifications. And I think if you are at the bottom of a league table and it's fair, then as a council you need to take that in the chin, and you need to get a plan of action to actually address it, and address it quickly. And if you need help from outside, I don't think you can be too proud. You've really got to take help from wherever you can to turn it round.
Ken?
Yeah. I mean, again, the immediate fear that every council had, I think, was that this was going to be used as an excuse for league tables, either by, well, obviously by the press, but whether it was going to be used as a league table by government organisations as well, or whether either side of the border. And I think that's something which we've been assured is being considered right at the start, and that your committee is determined to try to avoid that where at all possible. Again, gets back to the point of raw statistics, but they have to come with explanations, they have to be put in context. And I think we've all three of us at some stage this morning have tried to put statistics into a relevant context. What we have to do is be able to get out to the public what is actually happening within our council and what, if anything, we're doing about it. And I think that's the important thing, because it's part of a process. Benchmarking is not a one-off event, it's part of a process.
I think you give this committee much more power than it actually has, because no matter what, there will be league tables. It's an inevitability.
All right, power of wishful thinking, perhaps.
Yeah, John Pentland. Okay. Gentlemen, can I thank you very much for your time this morning? And can I suspend this session to allow for a change of seating? Thank you. Let's go. Indeed, let's go. Okay, our final witness today is Mark McAteer, Director of Governance and Performance Management at the Improvement Service. Mark, do you wish to make any opening statement?
Just a quick thank you to the committee for inviting me along again to speak to you again about benchmarking. It's much appreciated. Also to pass on apologies from David Martin and Ronnie Hines from Solace, who can't be with you today. They tried to rearrange diaries, but they just had other commitments they couldn't get out of. And I suppose lastly, being the third item on the menu, I just hope this doesn't mean I end up being the pudding course today, but I suppose time will tell.
Okay, thank you very much. Stewart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. Just basically to cover the same things that I've been asking others about the inputs and the outputs. To what extent do you think that the input measures, which are short-term to help you understand progress towards long-term outputs, are appropriately selected and evidenced as being good measures to help you understand progress to outputs?
Obviously, we did a significant amount of consultation with local authorities themselves, professional associations, audit and inspection bodies on the actual indicators that we've adopted for the suite. So I think collectively we're very confident that we've got exactly, I think as you say, those indicators that will tell us the direction of travel to broad outcomes themselves. If you take the collection as a whole, what we've tried to do through the suite is to have obviously cost information, because it's an important dimension, performance information about the service itself, how well is the bin collection service performing, etc. Customer satisfaction, how well do people actually perceive the services themselves? And it's when you take the totality of that together and read the data together, they become proxies for outcomes. They're not outcomes themselves, but they're good proxies towards that. And what we'll do is continue to improve those indicators over time. If there are better indicators that are out there, we'll happily adopt them, as long as they can meet the criteria that have been set by Solace for the project, that this can be done for all 32 councils without the creation of new data itself. So I think we're confident we've reasonably got it right at this stage, but we will improve it as we go on. And we will work with some of the other bodies, Audit Scotland, inspection bodies, as part of that journey as we go forward.
In my earlier questioning, I made reference to the process of normalisation to extract from measures in different councils in very different contexts what is similar and can be validly make them validly compared. How much support are you giving to councillors and councils, and are you satisfied that there is a proper normalisation process that will enable that to be done, so that council can really see where they can seek somebody else's good practice into their own?
A key principle from the outset for ourselves was not to invent new data, but to work with data that was already part of the public sector, that had gone through a degree of normalisation, I think to adopt your term, and that we were therefore reasonably confident was good data. In working with some of that data, it's become clear that it was never designed for benchmarking purposes. If you take something like the local financial return data, it's a useful data source. It's the best data source we have on comparative cost information for councils, but it's by no means a perfect data source for benchmarking purposes. So over the course of this year, we've been working with directors of finance to improve the data source on that basis. So particularly in dealing with things like support services. Different councils have traditionally accounted for support services in different ways, some of which reflects the structures that they adopt, some of which is just accountancy practice on an historical basis within their authority. So we've worked with directors of finance this year to produce a guide that allows us to standardise that element of the financial data better, so that it's accounted for in a more even basis across all 32 councils. I'm happy to say that this year, going forward into the 11-12 data, that guidance has been built in by Scottish Government colleagues into the local financial returns, so that the data that we're getting at the moment from the councils on the finances this year has that element built in so that it's much more robust, much more comparative going forward. So where we've identified those kinds of weaknesses, we work with partners to plug them, but the vast bulk of the data has already gone through that kind of quality assurance process before we start to use it to populate our indicators. But again, if we pick up or we find from colleagues elsewhere there are weaknesses in that data source, we'll plug the gap and we'll make sure that it is fit for purpose.
Can I just say normalisation is not my term. I think it's a
fairly standard term.
broadly used financial analyst's
Yes.
particular term. My wife in particular used to have a 7-dimensional mathematical model that was all about this, but that's for another time. Just one of the omissions on the list, I wonder if you could give me some insight. Perhaps it would come under corporate services, possibly elsewhere. I don't see procurement anywhere.
No, we've not. We started off working with Solace, and then the agreement with them was what they call big ticket issues. So the major spend areas of the council. Now, procurement is a big spend area, but there was work already underway through Scotland Excel. There are two other areas that we think at the moment have got a gap in terms of the framework. One is economic development. It's a low spend service, but quite strategically important for council areas.
With
for
small
employment.
inputs, but big outputs.
Big impact in the area. Yep. And what we've agreed with Solace is that once we get through this year, those gaps will be plugged going forward. So we will see something in procurement. We will see some indicators on economic development, and we'll see a couple of other areas. Planning is another area I think we need to get some more indicators.
Do you have
on.
a quick answer as to what proportion broadly across Scotland's councils of their expenditure goes through a procurement process?
Oh, it would be back in a five-packet
I
calculation. It's somewhere between 35–40%.
So it's quite a big omission.
It's a big area, yep.
Quite a big omission.
But as I say, there was work already underway at that stage when we started through Scotland Excel working as a collective procurement agency for Scotland. So what we've said is we will wait until they've got that and then we can then build that into the framework.
I understand that, but quis custodies, ipsos custodies, who are Excel benchmarking against?
They are the collective procurement.
Oh, no, I understand
so they're
that.
working with councils on that, looking at their collective procurement processes, and from that we can then simply adopt what we think or they think collectively with us is a good practice.
I think this is a line of questioning which is extremely important because the many councils are not using Scotland Excel to the same degree as others.
I agree.
And Mr. Stevenson and myself's part of the world, we're doing something rather differently in terms of the joint procurement unit at City and Shire. And I do think that this is something that seriously does need to be looked at. Mr. Stevenson.
I think that's probably enough for now.
Okay. Stuart McMillan on that point, and then John Wilson.
Thank you. So, Mr. McAteer, you just spoke there regarding some of the indicators that are there, and also that we heard earlier on that these are not set in stone, that they may change. In terms of going forward, do you anticipate that this suite of indicators will increase dramatically? So it may actually be seen not so much as an add-on, to use a phrase that was used by some earlier panellists, but for this to be seen as the key element of performance indicators within local authorities.
I mean, the key purpose behind this set of indicators is, I think someone used the phrase earlier on, they're can openers. They are strategic level indicators. So what we wouldn't anticipate is a massive growth in the number of indicators in this set. There are some additions, we were just talking, I think, that do need to be built in, but we might see some of these ones drop off over time and others replace them. But we wouldn't envisage hundreds of new strategic level indicators coming into the framework. Beneath this, though, there's a series of drill-down activities that are going to be required in order to explain some of the variation across councils that these indicators will highlight. And I think there again, there's a useful piece of work that could be done to look at that and try and standardise more some of those indicators so that you've got the golden thread, if you like, running from the top to the bottom through the performance area. So in this particular set, no, but there will be work in other sets of indicators to help rationalise some of that, pull it together, get it more coherent across the piece and so forth.
How developed is that other piece of work then?
We're doing some work with some of the agencies at the moment. So if again, mention just economic development, we're doing some work with SLADE, the Scottish Local Authority Economic Development Association, to look at a raft of indicators that they produced last year, again, to help streamline for them some of those indicators are much more management level information, but will still be important, if you like, once I say you drill down into these indicators that are necessary to then explain why different councils are performing differently. So that's just one example, and there are others where we'll do that, and again, there'll be dialogue with some of the inspection bodies around about some of that as well, because they're also the custodians of a lot of the data and the information that will be necessary at that level. So it's a big task for all of us. I think the note that the Scottish Government gave you for today, they mentioned a group called the Improving Evidence and Data Group, and that's one of the tasks that we've identified as that group should be taking forward, to look at that, to coordinate that type of work and to pull it together.
Thank you.
Okay. John Wilson, please.
Convener, just seeking clarification. Who's driving this agenda? Before you start answering that, because I've listened to you, you've indicated the improvement service is working with SOLAS. You indicated, and you talked about the we, and let's seek clarification. Who is the we? Is
government.
No, well, sorry, just Mr. McAteer, if I can just get clarification, because you've indicated that we are doing work with other agencies in Slade. We're in discussions with directors of finance. We wanted to see procurement on the list, but we are working towards increasing the list of benchmarking indicators. As I said, I'm just curious as to who is the we, and whether or not this is an agenda being driven by the improvement service, whether it's an agenda being driven by SOLAS, or whether it's, as you just said there, an agenda being driven by local government. And if it's local government, who is that local government? Because we seem to have a range of organisations that seem to be on the periphery of this, with the improvement service right in the middle.
Mark?
We were asked by SOLAS, Chief Executives Association for the 32 local authorities in Scotland, to support them in that work. So in effect, we are the day-to-day project managers, for want of a better term. But when I say we, what I mean by that is that SOLAS, the Improvement Service and COSLA collectively are the ones who are the driving force with the 32 councils. We work with the professional associations, directors of education, directors of social work, Slade directors, etc., in terms of economic development, to help us strengthen and improve the framework, and also, a phrase that's been mentioned several times this morning, take ownership, to help them be part of the framework, because they're the ones who are actually going to have to use it to drive performance. So this is a genuine collective local government effort. The we part is all of us together. The operational day-to-day part has been predominantly to date the improvement service.
John?
Commissioner, just as I said, is seeking clarification on that, because when I look at the COSLA paper doesn't give any indication that they were involved in the initial discussions regarding the benchmarking indices that have been put forward, because what they've indicated is SOLAS worked on it, then they went to directors of finance, then it came to COSLA. If it is a collective approach to benchmarking, at what stage do the various organisations get engaged in those discussions? Because clearly what you've indicated in response to my earlier question is that all these organisations are coming together to develop the benchmarking suite. But that's not what is stated in the COSLA paper. And it would be useful to get clarification as to at what stage the various organisations get involved. And you indicated yourself the improvement service was contacted by SOLAS to drive this forward. So it's really, I'm trying to just get an idea of who is actually driving the agenda, who's setting the agenda, and what agenda are we working to.
Mark?
Take your last point first. The agenda is an improvement agenda. So this is about how does local government use better performance data on a comparative basis to help councils drive their own improvement. That's where it started from. SOLAS, merely being the representatives of the chief executives, then asked us as their improvement agency, because we are the local authority's own improvement agency, to support them in that activity, and we've done so. But throughout each stage, and again there's papers previously that were circulated to the committee, and I can happily copy them to you if you wish, where we've worked with each of the major service areas, and again directors of education, directors of finance and others within that, to say, are these the right indicators for your sector? And with their assent, using them as part of the framework. SOLAS is simply the corporate voice of the council, if you like, at that level, and they're there to help coordinate the various different other parts of the council, the services, the associations that underpin that, and also working with the politicians. So COSLA have been briefed throughout the project, but it's been largely a technical exercise at this stage, driven by managers to get the right kind of information, the right kind of data, the right kind of indicators, and therefore it's been largely at the official level of the organisations that the bulk of the work has clearly been undertaken.
Convener, there's a number of other questions that arise from that, but I'll leave this for another day.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson on that point.
Thank you. I've just had this put in the context of being an improvement process, and clearly I wouldn't wish to disagree with that. But I just wonder, in a territory where there's a lot of improvement processes already embedded and so on and so forth, what is it that makes benchmarking distinctly different, and what does it add? And if you haven't worked out where I'm coming from by hearing my previous questions, I will follow up with a further question.
I'm sure you will. I think the purpose of the benchmarking framework was to get that comparative dimension to performance across 32 councils. So where do we all relatively stand against one another on common indicators? But from that, I think it's a point that you were trying to establish earlier on in some of the discussions, is to then get to identifying good practice. So whether we're in a rising tide or a falling tide, who within that context is performing best and why? Are there factors that the rest of us can learn from that, or other organisations can learn? That becomes the whole point of the exercise, is to get that shared understanding of where good practice lies and helping people then embed that practice within their own service context, their own organisations. That's what it's about at the end of the day.
Right, so it's enabling councils to steal other people's good ideas.
Yes, we used to call it plagiarism when I taught at universities. We now call it knowledge management.
Well, if I may say so, in the academic world, you get punished if you copy. In the business world, you get punished if you don't. and that's the big challenge I used to have with the graduates I used to recruit, getting them to change their mindset. But just to return to the point under discussion here, the improvement service therefore will be focused in assisting councils to understand and implement that distinctly different thing. It isn't simply another way of comparing performance. No. It's a tool to identify opportunities for positive change. Yes. And you'll be helping them to do that. Because if I may just make an observation, and it's a personal one, not a committee one, I think the politicians we've heard this morning perhaps have not fully got that. They have to varying degrees. They sort of, I could see them glimpsing it, but they haven't cleaved it to their hearts at the moment. And so you'll be helping them do that.
Yes, that's exactly it. Our role will be to support the councils in doing it. They are the ones who have to drive the improvement, but our role is critical in helping capture that learning, sharing that learning, and advising people how they may well take some of that forward, including politicians.
Just thinking of what I've just said, I'm not intending to make any comment about officials, because I'm not in a position to do that.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Just one very brief question on the back of Stuart Stevenson's questions there. In terms of the benchmarking, what is the timescale that's been put in place for benchmarking to become the central point of performance indicators, as compared to being the add-on that we did hear from the previous panel?
Mark?
That starts to drift into the world of policy. Unfortunately, as an organisation that doesn't do policy, we do the implementation once it's been created. I have to assent to the line that COSLA took. What our job has been is to get the benchmarking framework and the supporting processes for improvement as strong and as robust as we can with councils. And I think that allows councils to then legitimately argue with other public bodies, how does now the broader landscape around this shift and change in order to create space for this to improve and drive forward. And that will include discussions with inspection bodies, audit bodies, Scottish Government and so forth. Our role is simply to work on the improvement end of that. COSLA's role in the political end is then to make the lobbying activities that then say we need to create up space to allow this to grow, to be embedded further and to be strengthened further. So I really get to say it's not my job, I'm sorry.
Okay. Are you aware of any discussions that actually have taken place or any between the various bodies?
Certainly we've been part of the discussion and briefing the Accounts Commission, for example, and Audit Scotland, so that they've been aware of the project, how it's developed, what stage of development it's at and so forth. But then the policy discussions about what will happen next to the broader performance frameworks that govern local government are not something that the Improvement Service would be part of. It's not our role.
Thank you. John Pentland, please.
Mark, in the COSLA paper, I note that yourself, SOLAS and COSLA are working on a communications strategy.
Yeah.
And obviously part of that is about managing the media. Well, you would have heard me asking previous questions. If this benchmarking data is going to be publicised, then obviously ultimately that's going to lead to a league table which is going to sort of identify the worst councils. How far is your strategy? Where are you with your strategy in relation to handling that type of?
There are two elements to it. One is to get the data itself and get it analysed. So what does it start to tell us collectively as local government as well as the individual councils? And we're working at the moment with that. And the intention is that the public report, for want of a better term, will be published sometime in the new year. So early new year is when that should be ready. We're waiting on some key data from Scottish Government that doesn't get published until December to finalise some of the indicators. So that's why it'll be the new year. So within that report, there'll be contextual explanation information to help the public then understand what does this information tell you about your authority, how well it performs, etc. And some of the background pressures, be it welfare reform and how that impacts, have to be captured as part of that element. I think the second element, therefore, is about more how do we then message some of that through the media, because that's where most people will probably hear about it. And again, there's a piece of work that COSLA are leading on, not ourselves, to look at that media management, if you like. What are the core messages that have to be out there to then help people understand what the information's telling them about their council at the end of the day? Because this is partly what this is about, is also is better public accountability for council performance. So there is a strategy in place, but COSLA are the ones who have taken the lead at that, working with the councils themselves.
Okay. Yep. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. McIntosh, because it is Mr. McAteer. It is afternoon now. I think you sat through both evidence sessions, both from COSLA and the three council leaders. So I'm going to ask you maybe the question on how we achieve the ownership of benchmarking in three distinct areas. How you get it to be bought into by the members, by the staff, both at a frontline level and a managerial level, and if you could give an indication if you think this has already begun. What are the challenges, given that we've heard there are clearly variations between local authorities, and what role you think local authority leadership plays, both at officer and political level, in ensuring the success of the project?
Mark?
I'll maybe take your last point first of all, Margaret. I think the role of leaders is critical, both political and senior managers. They have to show that they value the process, and equally that they use the process itself, so it's not just a lot of work for people but for no real gain, real payoff at the end of the day. So I think that commitment from leaders is something that's been very strong from the outset of the project, and it's something that has to be sustained going forward. They have to be showing that they're actually using the process to full effect in order to keep the momentum within each of their own organisations amongst their staff to continue to be part of it. So that's absolutely critical. Part of the challenge, I suppose, in doing all of that are some of the other pressures that council staff services also experience. Whether that's, as we were hearing from some of the council leaders earlier on, is the kind of volume of activity that sometimes audit and inspection arrangements take up for many council staff. Supporting that and supporting your own improvement can be difficult. There are only so many hours in the day. And I think that will be one of the challenges. And I think, again, politically, one of the lines that COSLA has been exploring is, if we can put our house in order as local government, where does that then start to have implications for that broader inspection framework? And I'm happy to say we've had a lot of support from the inspection and audit bodies on this, and they're equally supportive of this direction of travel, because if we can get good data that's working for the improvement of council services, then that's also good data that they can use for audit and inspection purposes. So there's a lot of common interest there, but just the complexity and all of that, you know, we are talking about turning metaphorical super tankers around, and it just takes time, because the systems have to be built, existing systems have to accommodate that, and it takes us time to do that. That's probably the biggest challenge. The commitment, I think, from all sides has been pretty strong. When you then get down to individual councils, I think it is their role in terms of how do you now communicate this with staff. We have a role in helping them collectively work on that, to get good practice on that, but they have to take responsibility about engaging their frontline staff. We have a more direct role working with 21 councils who use a framework, a self-evaluation framework called Public Service Improvement Framework. And a key part of the rationale within that improvement framework is how they engage with staff. And we directly support those councils using that so that they've got good communication devices both downwards and upwards from staff. So there are things in place across most councils who do that, but really that's their business. Our role is help support, broker, and get some knowledge exchange again between councils and good practice for all of that. But they're the ones who really have to do it. I can't make them improve. They have to want to improve as organisations and services. That has to come from within the service itself.
Just to reinforce Stuart Stevenson's point then, as well as all this pressure and, doing all the work to make this improvement and getting that data out there, do you consider it key that they understand this is an opportunity?
Absolutely.
And that
get this right, I think, for service improvement purposes, and it will help people. But it will also help, I think, in terms of those other pressures that we've been speaking about.
And is that something Improvement Scotland will make a point of always saying to them? Because I didn't actually hear that in your response to Stuart Stevenson. He teased it out really in his response to you, and I think that is key to the whole success.
I agree, yeah.
Stuart Stevenson on that point?
It's going to work or fail, depending on how the staff in the front line respond. They will get bought in if there's something in it for them. What is it?
Mark?
I've worked with councils in a variety of roles for 20 years or so now. I've yet to experience any situation over that period where I've worked with members of the frontline staff who don't turn up to try and do a good day's job. I think at the end of the day, this is about helping them do that. This is about getting focused on the things that absolutely matter to drive services forward. And I say my experience is that's what their commitment is. So that's where it ties into for them.
Well,
it helps liberate, if you like, some of their imagination, some of their effort, and focus it in ways that can help drive the service. I'm not an expert, they are. My job is to put the frameworks around the architecture, if you like, that enables them to drive that performance improvement. And that's where this thing, I think, will help.
So you think our approach is going to energise frontline staff? Is that what you're saying?
I genuinely hope so. I would expect it to be.
Sorry,
I can't control that. I can't control that, Stuart. No, that's what I would expect to see. And hope to see.
I'm not holding you accountable for doing it, because I think that's the council's job. I'm asking for a professional feedback as to whether you think we're on the right track that will lead to staff in the front line being energised, feeling they have a contribution to make. And of course, that your answer will not necessarily apply 32 times. It might only be 20 times.
I would expect that to be the case. If it doesn't, then we will have a serious issue, a serious challenge. So yes, I agree with you. It's a necessary element.
Sorry, I'm just going to be persistent. Are we on the right track to do that?
I would say so, given that I've been the key architect, I suppose, in much of this. You would expect me to say that's the case.
Right, you will be held accountable for that on a later date, I'm
Thank you, Stewart. Anne McTaggart, please.
Good afternoon, Mr McIntosh. Focusing on, as you're probably aware, community planning partnership. What are the particular challenges of applying the benchmarking approach to community planning partnership, especially in terms of contribution to the delivery of outcomes?
I suppose there's a couple of things we need to be clear about when we talk about the work we've been doing so far with the councils on benchmarking and what might apply to community planning. This is ultimately about services and how they perform. At the moment, community planning partnerships don't deliver services. They're coordination bodies that allow key public partners to come together to agree key outcomes that they then try and reflect through their own delivery services. So benchmarking applied in that context at the moment would be slightly different. What we can do at the moment with benchmarking in CPPs is look at the outcomes being achieved in their area. What are the different life outcomes for people? We saw some data released yesterday from Scottish Government, for example, on health inequalities. We can take that and we can model down to very local levels, how does that apply in different communities in Scotland. In fact, we're working at the moment on a piece of software called ViewStat that we've been piloting with some of the councils and our broader public partners that will allow that process to be much easier. And again, it's something I happily copy to the committee that will allow you to kind of have a look at it. The idea is it does the technical part of bringing all the data that we have together about different parts of Scotland and then allowing you to take it right down to, if you wish, neighbourhood level, kind of data zone level, populations of about 750 people. That part we can do. The more complex part, if we're serious about benchmarking at CP level, will be then the contributions of different service bodies in terms of what they add to the outcomes in their area. And that will be an extensive piece of work. It'll be a very complex piece of work. Not only would some of the technicalities we've had to deal with here in terms of the accountancy system within local government have to be resolved. That would be true across each of the major public bodies themselves as well. So it'll be a very complex piece of work, but I think it's a piece of work that we should collectively commit to and start to undertake the elements of it. Certainly what we can do is then bring the learning and the experience of this particular piece of work to help support that going forward and give some advice and so forth to other partners. But I wouldn't underestimate the challenge that that element will take.
Anne, do you want to come back?
Yeah, really, we had heard from COSLA earlier that, I mean, obviously it's all going to roll out as of December.
This particular piece of work on the solace work, it's likely to be into the new year. As I say, we're waiting a couple of data sources from Scottish Government. They're controlled through national data standards. They just mean they cannot give us access to that data until mid-December. So until we get that, we can't populate a couple of our key indicators on children's services. So by the time we get that, it's likely to be after the new year. We'd be up to close to Christmas, and then there's a judgment that we would have to make. Would people think you were trying to sneak data out when nobody's looking, kind of thing? So I think it would be into the new year before we do the final actual publication of all the data.
Okay. We've heard lots of the positives today, Mark. What are the negatives here? What are the impediments that are still holding up this process? You've given one about a data source just now. What are the other things that may be holding this back?
I don't think there's not what's holding us back. It's just that it's an ongoing complex set of issues you're dealing with. And I think that's the biggest challenge we face. That it's not that people lack commitment. It's not that people aren't putting in effort. It just takes a lot of work. I mean, I noticed that at the start of both the other sessions, Chair, that you'd asked why is it taking so long. Yeah. Having done a trawl across some international contexts, 2 years to get to where we are is actually pretty impressive, to be honest. A lot of other contexts, whether it's Australia, Canada, where we've had a look, it's taking them longer. So I think we're actually doing pretty well in Scotland. There's a lot of effort behind this, not just from the local authority partners, but as I say, audit and inspection bodies as well. And I think we are making progress, but maintaining that progress is going to be important, given some of the other pressures that we were alluding to earlier from welfare reform, etc., as it hits the whole public sector and keep people focused on these improvement activities. That will be a challenge, I have no doubt, because they will be fighting fires and putting out crises elsewhere simultaneously.
So no negatives, no impediments at this moment in time?
It's not negatives, I think challenges. I mean, that sounds a horrible cliche when you say that out loud. We don't have problems, we have challenges these days. But there are those challenges, and they are more on the technical side of things rather than any real commitment or lack of ambition for people.
Okay, John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. I was tempted to follow on from the Convener to say that this process is in a long line of processes that have been engaged by local authorities in terms of best practice, best value, which preceded the indices that have now been put forward. I asked in the earlier session with the council leaders whether or not they had been approached by either the chief executives or the directors of finance to indicate whether or not there would be additional costs, staffing costs, staff resource, in relation to the work that's been done in the benchmarking issues. I'm going to ask, and this might seem a rather tricky question to ask yourself, Mr McAteer, but how much is the improvement service engagement costing to actually deliver on the benchmarking, and who's paying for that?
Mark?
Ultimately, local authorities pay for our service. We are a shared service of local government. We are their improvement body at the end of the day, and increasingly also for community planning partnerships through the role that the council has to support CPPs. Our total budget is about £1.3 million per annum, and that's paid for, as say, from the local authority settlement itself. This represents a substantial resource commitment on our part. A substantial part of my time and my staff, my team's time goes to this. There's no actual cash involved in this. This is just a work commitment from the improvement service because we think it's a strategically important development for local government, and we're absolutely happy to support that. So we've made sure that it's one of our business priorities as an organisation. So it's staff time that it's taken, not cash at the end of the day.
It's 1.3 million that comes out local government settlement.
For the whole of the improvement service to cover all of our activities, working with 32 councils and all services in between.
Right, thank you very much indeed.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time today. Again, Mr McAteer, I suspend this meeting and we now go into private session.